Somewhere beneath your feet, buried under centuries of dust and silt and forgetting, there might be a city whose name no one will ever know. Not a myth, not a legend. A real place where real people lived and worked and loved and died, and then simply vanished from the story of humanity as if they'd never existed at all. That's not a comforting thought to fall asleep to, but it's a true one. And tonight we're going to sit with it for a while. Here's the question that should keep you up at night, if you weren't so determined to fall asleep tonight. What if most of human history has already disappeared? Not the big stuff, not the pyramids, or the Colosseum, or the Great Wall. Those survived because stone is stubborn and because we got lucky. I mean everything else. The thousands of years of human innovation, culture and complexity that left no trace we've ever found. Whole civilizations that rose, flourished, maybe even rivaled anything we consider impressive today, and then were erased so completely that we don't even know to look for them. It's a strange kind of blindness, isn't it? We assume that because we haven't found evidence of something, it never happened. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's just absence. And when you start pulling on that thread, when you start asking what kinds of things could erase an entire civilization from the historical record, flood, fire, time, forgetting, colonization, simple bad luck, you realize just how thin the thread of recorded history really is. Now, before you let your imagination run wild with visions of Atlantis and lost technological super-civilizations, let's set some ground rules right at the start. This isn't a show about ancient aliens or hidden pyramids under the ice caps. We're not here to convince you that some forgotten society had smartphones 10,000 years ago. What we are here to do is much more interesting, honestly. We're going to look at real archaeological evidence, real geological data, real historical records, and follow them wherever they lead. Sometimes that leads to genuinely mind-bending discoveries, cities drowned by rising seas, monuments built by hunter-gatherers we assumed were too primitive for such things, whole written languages that still can't be read today. Sometimes the truth is stranger than the speculation. We just have to be patient enough to let the evidence speak for itself. Before we go further into the deep, quiet spaces of forgotten history, I want to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop it in the comments. Your city, your country, whatever time it is right where you are. I read every single one, and it never stops amazing me. Someone's falling asleep in Tokyo while someone else is just waking up in Toronto. Someone's watching the sun set over Lisbon, while someone else has 3 hours left until dawn in Sydney. It's a strange, beautiful thing, all of us scattered across such different moments, gathering around the same quiet mystery. And if stories like this help you drift off, if you find some comfort in wondering about the deep past while your eyes get heavy, the kindest thing you can do is follow the show on Spotify. Listen there when you can't sleep, and if you're enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and the link is right there in the description whenever you need it. So let's get into it. Let's talk about just how incomplete our picture of the past really is. Because once you understand how much has already been lost, quietly, permanently, without ceremony, you start to see the entire story of human civilization differently. Not as a straight line from cave to skyscraper, but as a series of fragments, echoes of things we can only partially reconstruct, whispers from silences we're only beginning to learn how to hear. Let's start with a word we've been throwing around loosely: civilization. It sounds so simple until you actually try to define it, and then it starts slipping through your fingers like sand. Most of us, if pressed, would probably describe civilization using images borrowed from our own moment in history. Skyscrapers, computers, cars. Maybe we'd throw in written laws, hospitals, and international trade agreements. We tend to picture progress as a straight line moving upward. starting with cavemen banging rocks together and ending with us, scrolling through our phones in climate-controlled rooms. Simple, linear, comforting in a way, because it makes us feel like the pinnacle of something. Like we're standing at the top of a very tall staircase, and everyone before us was just climbing toward where we are now. But that picture is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. And once you start looking closely at the archaeological record, you realize that the story of human sophistication is far stranger and far more scattered than a staircase. It looks more like a forest with 1,000 different trees, growing at different speeds, reaching different heights, some of them flourishing brilliantly for a while, and then dying back completely, while others we barely notice. So let's actually define what we mean when we say advanced civilization, because the definition matters more than you'd think. Archaeologists and anthropologists generally look for a cluster of features when they're trying to identify something as a civilization in the fullest sense. Cities meaning permanent settlements large enough and dense enough to require organized planning, infrastructure, and social hierarchy. States meaning centralized political authority capable of coordinating large groups of people, enforcing laws, collecting resources, organizing labor. Writing, or at least some system of durable record-keeping that allows information to be transmitted beyond the memory of any single person. Engineering, the ability to shape the physical environment, build structures, manage water, construct monuments that outlast their builders. Trade networks, connections that move goods, ideas, and people across distances, sometimes surprisingly vast distances. And scientific knowledge, systematic understanding of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, agriculture, the natural world. Notice something about that list. None of it requires steam engines. None of it requires electricity or steel or computer chips. A society could have cities, states, writing, incredible engineering, elaborate trade, and sophisticated science, and still look to modernize, almost unrecognizably different from what we picture when we hear the word advanced. And here's where things get genuinely interesting, because a society doesn't need all 6 of those features to be remarkable. Some civilizations built breathtaking monuments without ever developing writing. Some developed complex writing systems we still can't read today, meaning their knowledge is locked away, present but inaccessible, which is its own kind of erasure. Some had sprawling trade networks spanning thousands of miles without building a single permanent city. Some had sophisticated astronomical knowledge, tracking the movements of stars and planets with startling precision, while living in what looks, at first glance, like simple villages. This matters enormously for our purposes tonight, because it means the absence of pyramids doesn't mean the absence of sophistication. The absence of writing doesn't mean the absence of complex thought. A people who left behind no monumental architecture might still have possessed intricate social systems, deep scientific understanding, extensive trade relationships, and rich cultural traditions that simply didn't require, or didn't survive as stone and clay tablets. Think about what actually survives from any given society across thousands of years. Stone survives, fired clay survives, certain metals survive if conditions are right. But wood rots, textiles disintegrate, leather crumbles. Spoken language, unless written down and unless that writing survives and unless someone thousands of years later can actually translate it, simply vanishes into silence the moment the last speaker dies. Social structures, laws, religious beliefs, oral histories, none of that leaves a physical trace, unless it happens to get carved into rock or baked into clay at exactly the right historical moment, and then happens to survive fire, flood, war, and time. This is why so many genuinely capable societies left almost nothing durable behind. Not because they were primitive, not because they lacked intelligence or organization or culture, but because the specific materials and conditions required for long-term preservation are rare, almost accidental. A civilization built primarily from wood in a wet climate has essentially no chance of leaving architectural evidence behind after a few thousand years. A civilization that relied on oral tradition instead of writing might have possessed extraordinarily sophisticated knowledge systems, and we would have almost no way of proving it, unless that knowledge happened to get transcribed by outsiders, or unless fragments of it survived embedded in later cultures. So when we ask whether an advanced civilization could disappear from history entirely, we're really asking a question about materials, climate, and luck as much as we're asking about human capability. Now I want to draw a clear line here, because it matters for everything we're going to explore tonight. There's a real difference between a lost culture, meaning a genuinely sophisticated society whose specific history, language, and identity have been forgotten or erased, and a hypothetical lost industrial civilization, meaning some ancient society that supposedly possessed technology comparable to our modern industrial world. Those are very different claims, and they deserve very different levels of scrutiny. We know with a high degree of confidence that entire cultures, cities, languages, and knowledge systems have been lost. We'll spend plenty of time tonight exploring exactly how and why. But the idea that some ancient society had electricity, or advanced machinery, or anything resembling our modern technological infrastructure, that's an entirely different kind of claim, and it's simply not supported by the archaeological or geological evidence we currently have. Industrial civilization leaves fingerprints that are almost impossible to hide completely. Mining leaves scars in the geological record, large-scale manufacturing leaves, chemical signatures in ice cores and sediment layers. We don't see those signatures before our own industrial revolution, and that absence is meaningful in a way that the absence of a wooden city in a rainforest is not. So tonight, we're not chasing ancient power plants or forgotten computers. We're doing something more grounded and, honestly, more unsettling once you sit with it. We're exploring how thoroughly the ordinary, undeniable achievements of real human societies, their cities, their languages, their trade networks, their systems of knowledge, can be erased almost completely, leaving barely a whisper for us to find thousands of years later. Once you understand civilization this way, not as a straight ladder we're all climbing towards some inevitable technological peak, but as a vast, branching, often fragile experiment repeated again and again across different landscapes and different centuries, the whole shape of human history starts to shift beneath your feet. And that shift is exactly where we're headed next, into the deep, quiet expanse of time itself, and just how much of it remains genuinely unaccounted for. And this is where the scale of the problem starts to become almost difficult to hold in your mind. Written history, the part of the past that feels solid to us, the part with names and dates and kings and wars and taxes and people complaining in letters about late shipments of grain, is incredibly short. The earliest known writing systems appear a little more than 5,000 years ago. That sounds ancient. 5,000 years is a long time. It is longer than all of recorded history in most parts of the world. It reaches back before Rome, before Greece, before the pyramids had become ancient tourist attractions for later Egyptians. But now, pull back. Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. Not modern civilization, not cities, but people recognizably like us, with minds capable of planning, teaching, grieving, cooperating, adapting, and probably telling stories beneath the night sky. For more than 98% of our species' existence, there was no writing at all. No books, no archives, no names preserved in ink, no one recording which village traded with which village, who discovered a useful plant, who led a migration through a dangerous mountain pass, who built the first house beside a river that no longer exists. And if we widen the frame beyond our own species, the human story becomes deeper still. Earlier members of the human lineage were making stone tools more than 2 million years ago. Other human species lived, adapted, spread, and disappeared across enormous spans of time. Neanderthals endured in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Denisovans ranged across parts of Asia, leaving behind only a handful of bones, a few teeth, fragments of DNA, and a great deal of mystery. Homo erectus survived for an astonishing length of time, perhaps nearly 2 million years in one form or another. Think about that. Entire human worlds existed for periods far longer than the gap between us and the first cities. And what do we have from most of them? A stone flake, a broken tooth, a patch of dark soil, a few animal bones with cut marks. Maybe a hearth if the ash was protected in just the right place. Maybe footprints preserved in mud that turned to stone before rain, wind, roots and scavengers could erase them. That is the archive, not a library, not even a ruined library. More like a few pages torn from millions of books, scattered across continents, buried at different depths, and written in a language made of sediment, chemistry, and broken objects. This is one of the most important things to understand before we go any further. The archaeological record is not a complete map of the past with a few blank spaces in it. It is the opposite. It is mostly blank space with rare islands of survival. The landscapes where people actually lived are usually the very landscapes least likely to preserve evidence of them. Humans tend to settle near water. Rivers, lakes, coastlines, fertile valleys, floodplains. Places with food, transport, fresh water, rich soils, animals, fish, useful plants. Exactly the places where erosion, flooding, changing river channels, rising seas, and later human settlement can destroy or bury what came before. A river valley may look peaceful now, a slow current, reeds bending at the edge, maybe a few birds moving through the shallows. But over thousands of years, rivers are restless things. They migrate, they cut into one bank and deposit mud on another. They flood, sometimes gently, sometimes with enough force to move trees, boulders, houses, entire sections of land. A campsite beside a river can be washed away in a single season, or it can be buried beneath meters of silt, preserved but invisible, waiting beneath farms, towns, roads, and later settlements. Coastlines are even more unstable. Sea levels rise and fall. Storms rearrange beaches. Waves grind stone into sand grain by grain. And during the last ice age, when huge amounts of water were locked in glaciers, sea level was far lower than it is today. Vast areas of land that were once coastal plains, river mouths, hunting grounds, and likely settlement zones now lie beneath the ocean. So when we look at a map of ancient human settlement and see only a handful of sites inland, we have to remember what may be missing. The places most attractive to people may now be drowned, eroded, or buried beneath modern coastlines. Not necessarily lost cities waiting intact on the sea floor. Usually the sea is much less romantic than that. It breaks, disperses, and covers. But the evidence of ordinary camps, villages, paths, wooden structures, fishing places, and seasonal gathering grounds may be gone from view simply because the world itself has changed shape. Then there is ice. Glaciers are not just frozen landscapes. They are geological machines. During ice ages, great sheets of moving ice can scrape across the ground with immense force, grinding soil, stone, forests, bones, and ancient surfaces into rubble. In northern Europe, Canada, and parts of Asia, glaciers repeatedly advanced and retreated over territories where humans and earlier hominins may once have lived. Each advance could erase vast stretches of the old landscape, not hide them, not bury them neatly, erase them. Imagine trying to reconstruct the history of a city after someone had taken a giant sheet of sandpaper to the ground beneath it for thousands of years. That is what glaciation can do. Tectonic movement works on an even larger scale. The Earth's crust is always shifting, slowly enough that we barely notice it in a human lifetime, but relentlessly over hundreds of thousands and millions of years. Mountains rise, basins sink, earthquakes fracture landscapes, coastlines are lifted from the sea or dragged beneath it. Entire regions are folded, heated, crushed and recycled deep into the planet. The oldest archaeological sites are therefore not simply hard to find because nobody has looked hard enough. Sometimes the ground they once stood on no longer exists in any recognizable form. It has been carried away by erosion, buried beneath volcanic deposits, swallowed by the sea, or transformed by forces operating far beyond anything human beings can control. And yet, strangely, some things do survive. A cave can shelter layers of occupation from rain and wind. Dry desert air can preserve footprints, fibres, and even human remains that would vanish almost anywhere else. Waterlogged mud can seal wood and leather away from oxygen. Volcanic ash can cover a landscape quickly, preserving a single terrible moment. Deep burial can protect a site from later disturbance. These places become archaeological miracles, but that is exactly what they are, exceptions. When archaeologists find a cave with tens of thousands of years of human occupation, it can feel like an uninterrupted window into the past. Layer after layer, stone tools, animal bones, charcoal, pigments, burials, signs of changing climate and changing behaviour. But even there, the record is incomplete. People did not live in caves all the time. Caves preserve the moments when they used caves, the open-air camps, temporary shelters, seasonal hunting sites, wooden buildings and pathways between them are much less likely to remain. A stone tool may survive for hundreds of thousands of years, but it tells us only so much. It can show planning, skill, and perhaps the movement of raw materials across a landscape. It cannot tell us what songs were sung while it was made. It cannot tell us whether the person who made it was admired, feared, lonely, ill, funny, or grieving. It cannot tell us the name of the child who watched and learned the technique. Fossils are even rarer. Most bodies do not become fossils. They decay, are eaten, scattered, dissolved, trampled, burned, or carried away. To become part of the deep record, remains need an unlikely combination of conditions: rapid burial, favourable chemistry, protection from scavengers and weather, then survival through all the geological violence that follows. For every ancient skeleton we find, there may have been countless individuals who left no trace at all. This means we have to be very careful with a phrase people often use casually: absence of evidence. Sometimes absence of evidence really does matter. If someone claims that an ancient society operated factories, mined metals on an industrial scale, or built global technological networks, we would expect broad and durable traces. We would expect unusual chemical signatures, large-scale extraction, manufactured materials, widespread debris. If those things are missing, that absence is important. But at other scales, absence is much harder to interpret. If we find no evidence of a wooden village from 100,000 years ago, that does not prove nobody built wooden shelters. If we find no written account of a culture that never used writing, that does not prove the culture lacked history, law, science, memory, or sophistication. If a coastline from the Ice Age is now 100 meters underwater, the lack of visible settlements on today's shore tells us almost nothing about what once existed beyond it. The honest position is not that anything could have happened. Archaeology is not a blank check for every imaginable lost world. Evidence still matters. Patterns matter. Geology matters. What survives, where it survives, and what we would reasonably expect to find all matter. But the honest position is also this: silence has causes. Sometimes the past is silent because nothing was there. Sometimes it is silent because what was there was made of wood, fibre, skin, earth, and memory. Sometimes it is silent, because the river moved, the glacier came, the sea rose, the mountain fell, or 10,000 years of rain patiently carried the evidence away. So the deeper we go into human time, the less we should imagine history as a brightly lit hallway stretching behind us. It is more like walking through a vast dark landscape after a storm. Here and there a stone wall rises from the grass. A shard of pottery glints in the soil. A footprint appears briefly in hardened ash. And around every fragment is an enormous darkness, not empty exactly, but unread. Which brings us to one of the greatest blind spots in the human story. Because some of the richest landscapes our ancestors ever inhabited are not merely buried or eroded. They are underwater at the height of the last ice age. Roughly 20,000 years ago, the map of the world looked very different. Not different in the way it looks after a border changes or a city gets renamed. Different in the physical shape of the continents themselves. So much water had been locked away in enormous glaciers that global sea level was perhaps 120 metres lower than it is today. That is nearly the height of a 40-storey building. Remove that much water from the oceans, and the coastline does not just shift a little. Entire landscapes emerge. Places that are now shallow seas were once broad plains. River valleys extended far beyond the modern shore. Islands were connected to continents. Estuaries became grasslands. Bays became lakes. And across these newly exposed lands, people hunted, gathered plants, built shelters, made tools, buried their dead, raised children, traded materials, told stories, and watched horizons that no longer exist. This is the drowned world. It was not one single lost continent, and it was not a secret global civilization erased in a single night. The reality is more complicated, and in some ways more haunting. It was a vast patchwork of ordinary human landscapes. Campsites beside old rivers, seasonal fishing grounds, places where herds crossed open plains, shelters built from wood, hide, reeds, and bone, small communities living close to water, because water was where life gathered. Then the ice began to melt. As the climate warmed after the last glacial maximum, glaciers retreated. Water that had been stored on land returned to the sea. Over thousands of years, oceans rose and rose again, swallowing the edges of continents. In some places, the change was slow enough for generations to adapt. A shoreline moved inland a few meters at a time. A familiar hunting ground became marsh. A marsh became tidal flat. A river mouth widened into an estuary. People could move their camps, carry their tools, follow the animals, and remember that their grandparents had once walked where boats now floated. But slow does not mean harmless. For communities living low on the landscape, every rise in sea level meant fewer places to live. Saltwater entered freshwater wetlands. Forests died where tides reached their roots. Rivers changed course. The best fishing spots shifted. The coastline that had provided food, transport and connection became unstable. And at certain moments, melting ice sheets released huge pulses of water into the oceans, making the rise faster and more disruptive. Imagine living on a coastal plain for centuries. Your people know every stream, every stand of trees, every safe crossing, every place where fish gather in spring. Then, within the span of a few lifetimes, that whole map begins to disappear. Not destroyed by an invading army, not burned in a war, simply taken field by field, path by path beneath a rising sea. One of the clearest examples is Doggerland. Today, Doggerland lies beneath the cold grey waters of the North Sea, between Britain and mainland Europe. But during the Ice Age, Britain was not an island. It was connected to what are now the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany and Denmark by a huge expanse of low-lying land. Rivers crossed it, lakes and wetlands filled parts of it. Herds of animals moved through it. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers lived there after the ice began to retreat, exploiting a landscape that may have been rich in fish, birds, plants and game. For a long time, Doggerland was almost invisible to history. Fishermen occasionally pulled ancient bones, stone tools, and pieces of worked antler from the North Sea floor. Mammoth remains, reindeer remains, artifacts shaped by human hands, strange evidence from a place that no longer appeared on any map. Now archaeologists, geologists, and offshore survey teams are slowly reconstructing parts of that vanished terrain. Seismic surveys, originally developed for oil and gas exploration, can reveal ancient river channels buried below seabed sediments. Sediment cores can contain pollen from forests that once grew there. They can hold traces of freshwater environments, ancient soils, charcoal, and sometimes fragments of the lives people lived before the water arrived. The picture that emerges is not of an empty land bridge. People hurried across on their way somewhere else. It was a homeland in its own right, and Doggerland was only one piece of a much larger pattern. To the east, Beringia connected Siberia and Alaska during periods of low sea level. It was not simply a narrow bridge over which people crossed into the Americas. At times it was an enormous region of steppe, wetlands and river systems, large enough to support plants, animals and human populations for thousands of years. Much of it is now underwater beneath the Bering and Chukchi seas. Farther south, the Sunda Shelf connected mainland Southeast Asia with islands that are now separated by water. During lower sea levels, parts of present-day Indonesia formed a much larger landmass, often called Sundaland. Rivers flowed across plains that are now submerged. Coastlines lay far beyond their modern positions. Human groups moving through this region would have encountered a geography almost impossible to picture from a modern map. And there were other drowned margins around nearly every continent. The Persian Gulf basin may have contained a fertile lowland during periods when sea level was lower. Parts of the Black Sea region changed dramatically as water levels shifted. Along the coasts of Africa, India, Australia, the Americas, and East Asia, ancient shorelines now lie far offshore. This matters because coastlines are not marginal places. They are often among the most attractive places humans can live. A coast offers food in layers: fish, shellfish, seabirds, seals in some regions, edible plants, tidal pools, fresh water from rivers meeting the sea. A shoreline is also a highway. Before roads, before carts, before railways, water offered a way to move people and materials over long distances. Canoes and simple boats can carry far more than a person walking alone. Even groups without elaborate vessels could follow beaches, cross short channels, exchange materials between neighbouring communities, and build social connections along rivers and coasts. Coasts also bring different environments close together. Forest, grassland, wetland, river and sea can all meet within a short journey. That variety makes it easier to survive bad seasons. If game is scarce inland, perhaps shellfish are available near shore. If storms make fishing dangerous, perhaps birds, plants or river fish provide another option. For people living without supermarkets, storage warehouses or emergency supply chains, that kind of ecological flexibility could be enormously valuable. So, if early humans preferred these rich coastal zones, where is the evidence? That is the problem. It is underwater. Finding archaeology beneath the sea is extraordinarily difficult. On land, an archaeologist can walk a field, inspect an exposed cliff, dig a test trench, or notice a scatter of stone tools on the surface. Underwater, visibility may be poor, currents can be strong. Sediment can be deep. Waves and tides can move objects far from where they were originally left. Modern shipping, fishing, dredging, construction, and erosion may have disturbed the seabed. And the potential search area is enormous. A site that was once beside a river may now be 50, 80, or 100 meters below sea level, buried under layers of mud and sand. It may not look like a site at all. A wooden post may have decayed. A hearth may have been scattered. A camp may survive only as a thin, dark stain in ancient soil, detectable only if someone takes a core in exactly the right location. There are remarkable finds: submerged stone tools, ancient fish traps, waterlogged wood, traces of settlements preserved in sheltered bays, lakes and caves, now partly flooded by the sea. But these discoveries are rare not necessarily because coastal people were rare, but because the work required to find them is slow, expensive, and technically demanding, and the ocean does not preserve everything kindly. Sometimes waterlogged sediment can protect organic materials better than dry land ever could. Wood, plant fibres, baskets, even footprints can survive where oxygen is excluded. But exposed shorelines are brutal. Waves grind. Storms scour. Sand shifts. A settlement on an ancient beach may have been dismantled piece by piece long before archaeologists ever had a chance to look for it. This means the visible archaeological record may be tilted inland. We find caves. We find rock shelters. We find high ground. We find places that escaped the sea. But the missing coastal record could include countless communities that lived where humans so often choose to live, near water, near food, near travel routes, near other people. Not cities of glass towers beneath the waves, not proof that every ancient mystery hides a forgotten empire. The evidence does not support that kind of story, but it does support something quieter and more profound. The early human world was probably more populated, more connected, and more geographically varied than the surviving map suggests. Many communities may have left traces that were later drowned. Many innovations may have happened in places now beyond ordinary reach. The first experiments in fishing technology, boat building, long-distance exchange, coastal navigation, and seasonal gathering may often have taken place on shorelines that no longer exist, and when those landscapes vanished, their history went with them. The sea did not erase humanity. People adapted, they moved inland. They followed the changing coast, they carried skills, memories, and family connections into new territories. But the places themselves were lost, their homes, their paths, their small inventions, their everyday struggles, their local knowledge of a particular river mouth or tidal marsh, all slipped below the waterline, which leaves us with a strange possibility. Some of the most important chapters in the human story may not be hidden in distant caves or buried beneath deserts. They may lie under ordinary stretches of sea beneath fishing boats, cargo ships, and rolling grey waves, waiting for technologies and patience we are only beginning to develop. And even on dry land, there is another reason the past can seem emptier than it really was. For most of human history, people built extraordinary lives without building things designed to last. For most of human history, people built extraordinary lives without building things designed to last, and that can make them look far simpler than they were. We are trained, almost without realizing it, to measure the importance of a society by what remains standing: a pyramid, a palace, a city wall, a temple carved into stone. The bigger the ruin, the more serious we assume the people must have been. The less stone they left behind, the easier it is to imagine them as primitive, isolated, barely surviving from one day to the next. But stone is not intelligence. A monument is not the same thing as a civilization. And the absence of monuments does not mean the absence of knowledge, planning, art, trade, ritual, or complex social life. It may simply mean that people built with wood instead of stone, with reeds, with bark, with hides, with woven grasses. It may mean they moved their homes seasonally, following fish runs, migrating herds, ripening plants, or changing weather. It may mean that their greatest achievements were carried in memory, spoken aloud, taught by demonstration, sung beside fires, and passed from grandparents to children for hundreds of generations. None of that survives easily. Imagine two communities living at the same time, equally skilled, equally intelligent, equally capable of cooperation. One builds a shrine from massive stone blocks on a dry hillside. The other builds an elaborate meeting house from cedar, constructs boats from hollowed trunks, weaves clothing from plant fibers, and maintains a network of relationships stretching across 1,000 kilometers. 10,000 years later, which one looks more impressive to an archaeologist? The stone shrine may still be there, the meeting house may be gone. The boats may be gone, the clothing may be gone, even the paths between communities may have vanished beneath forest, farmland, roads or water. What remains could be a few stone flakes, fragments of charcoal, animal bone, and a scatter of shells. Enough to prove people were present, not enough, at first glance, to show what they knew. This is one of the great distortions of deep history. The archaeological record does not preserve human achievement evenly. It preserves durable materials. Stone lasts, fired clay lasts. Metal can last, at least under the right conditions, but wood rots, leather decays, baskets collapse, rope disappears, textiles vanish, food stores are eaten, burned or turned back into soil. A carefully built village can dissolve almost completely in a few centuries if it was made from earth, timber and plant material. And yet these were the materials that made life possible. A wooden spear may be more important to a hunting community than any stone tool found beside it. A woven net may feed dozens of people. A canoe may connect communities separated by rivers, coasts and islands. A warm coat sewn with bone needles and fitted to the body can mean the difference between life and death in a cold climate. A basket light enough to carry and strong enough to hold gathered food can transform what a group is able to collect, store and share. But unless rare conditions preserve them, these objects leave almost nothing behind. Sometimes, though, the past gives us a brief glimpse. In waterlogged ground, deep caves, deserts, glaciers, peat bogs or lake sediments, organic materials can survive long enough to reveal a world that ordinary archaeology misses. We find wooden tools, fragments of cordage, woven fibres, preserved footprints, ancient nets and fish traps, carved objects made from bone, antler, ivory and wood. And whenever these exceptional sights appear, they often suggest that the vanished majority was far more materially sophisticated than the usual stone-heavy record would imply. Take textiles. Fabric almost never survives from the deepest periods of prehistory. But the tools associated with textile production sometimes do. Spindle whorls, needles, awls, traces of fibre impressions in clay. These hints suggest people were twisting plant fibres, animal hair and other materials into cord, rope, nets, bags and clothing long before most actual fabric had any chance of surviving. And making a textile is not a trivial skill. You need to know which plants provide usable fibre, when to harvest them, how to strip, soak, dry, comb, twist and weave them. You need to understand tension, strength, water resistance, insulation and repair. You may need dyes, patterns and specialized tools. You need people who can teach the process accurately. A woven object is, in a sense, stored knowledge. It is a technology made from thousands of remembered decisions. The same is true of woodwork. Wood is everywhere in human history, and almost nowhere in the archaeological record. Before metal tools became widespread, people made handles, digging sticks, bows, spears, paddles, traps, shelters, containers, and perhaps even complex machines from wood. They shaped it with stone tools, fire, abrasion, and patient skill. They selected different species for different purposes. A flexible wood for bows, a dense wood for digging sticks, a rot-resistant wood for posts, a light wood for boats. A society that understood its forest was not merely living in nature. It was reading a vast library of materials. Then there is navigation. For people accustomed to modern maps, satellites, and compass needles, it can be hard to appreciate what it means to travel confidently through a landscape without any of them. But mobile communities often possessed extraordinarily detailed geographical knowledge. They knew rivers that changed course with the seasons. They knew where water remained during drought. They knew which beaches were safe to land on, which channels became dangerous in a storm, which mountain passes stayed open, which stars rose at useful times of year. Across Australia, the Pacific, the Arctic, the Americas, Africa, and Eurasia, indigenous and traditional knowledge systems have preserved astonishingly precise understandings of land, sea, animals, plants, weather, and seasonal change. These traditions are diverse. They should not be treated as one single ancient system. But together they show what human minds can accomplish when knowledge is refined over many generations by people whose survival depends on getting it right. A route might not exist as a line on a map. It might exist as a story. Turn where the river bends beneath the red cliff. Travel after the first rains. Watch for a certain bird. Do not cross the valley when the wind comes from the east. Follow the ridge until a particular cluster of stars appears above it. Gather shellfish only after the tide has fallen far enough. Burn this patch of grass in this season, but not that one. To an outsider, this may sound like folklore. To the people who carry it, it can be a practical system for moving through the world. Oral traditions are especially difficult for archaeology because words disappear the moment they are spoken, unless someone records them. Yet spoken knowledge may have been one of the largest technologies ever developed. Long before writing, people could preserve genealogies, territorial boundaries, rituals, navigation routes, medicinal practices, rules of marriage, hunting strategies, and memories of past disasters through stories, songs, performances, and repeated ceremonies. Not perfectly. No tradition is frozen in time. Stories change as they are retold. But they can also carry information with remarkable persistence, especially when communities build careful systems of teaching around them. And this is where the old image of prehistoric people as isolated little bands begins to fall apart. Even communities without cities often participated in long-distance exchange networks. Archaeologists find obsidian from distant volcanic sources, shells carried far inland, amber moved across regions, pigments transported over long distances, and stone selected from quarries many days or weeks away. These materials did not always travel directly from one person to another. A shell may have passed through many hands. A piece of obsidian may have moved gradually along a chain of neighbouring groups. But the result is clear. People were connected. They had relationships beyond their immediate camp. They knew that certain materials came from particular places. They valued objects not only for practical use, but sometimes for colour, rarity, beauty, identity, or ritual meaning. Exchange required trust. It required shared expectations. It required people to meet, negotiate, remember obligations, and perhaps arrange marriages or alliances across large distances. That is not a simple world. It is a world with social geography. A world where a river crossing, a quarry, a seasonal gathering place, or a coastal inlet might matter, because generations of people had made it matter. Symbolic art tells a similar story. Long before cities, humans painted animals in caves, engraved lines and patterns on bone and stone, made beads from shells and teeth, carved figurines, and used pigments in ways that seem to have had social or ritual meaning. We cannot always know what these images meant. A painted bison is not a written sentence. A hand stencil does not come with an explanation. Archaeologists must be cautious. But the act itself matters. To make an image that is not simply functional, to decorate the body, to wear a bead from a distant shore, to mark a wall deep inside a cave, suggests a mind concerned with more than immediate hunger. It suggests identity, memory, belonging, perhaps spirituality, perhaps storytelling, perhaps a way of saying, this is who we are, this is what we remember, this is what matters. And art may have done practical work too. Symbols can help bind groups together. They can mark membership, they can turn knowledge into something memorable. A design on a garment, a carved pattern on an object, a repeated image in a shelter, may carry messages that everyone in a community understands and outsiders do not. The problem is that we tend to see only the messages written in stone. A mobile community may leave no palace because it does not need one. It may have no permanent temple because its sacred places are springs, caves, hills, groves, river mouths, animal migration routes, or stretches of coastline visited at particular times of year. Its wealth may not be piled in a treasury. It may exist in stored food, living animals, reciprocal obligations, knowledge of landscapes, skillful hands and relatives in distant places. Its political system may not produce kings with carved names. Decisions may be made through elders, ritual specialists, family councils, seasonal gatherings, or alliances that shift as conditions change, that can make the society difficult to classify using the categories created for later states. No throne, no tax records, no city wall, but perhaps a highly organized way of life all the same. And mobility itself can make people nearly invisible. Suppose a group returns to the same lake shore for 2 weeks every autumn, harvesting fish during a seasonal run. They build temporary shelters, repair nets, smoke fish, trade with neighbouring groups, hold ceremonies, and then leave. The next year they return, and the next. This pattern may continue for centuries. What does it leave behind? Maybe a hearth, maybe fish bones, maybe broken stone tools, maybe post holes if the soil is kind. But floods can scatter the bones, roots can disturb the hearth. Later visitors can reuse the site. A rising lake can cover it. A farmer can plough through it. After thousands of years, the evidence may look like a faint, confusing trace. Now multiply that problem across entire continents. Many prehistoric communities were not wandering randomly through empty wilderness. They were moving through known territories on regular schedules. They may have had winter camps, summer camps, fishing stations, hunting grounds, gathering areas, quarry sites, and meeting places. Their lives were seasonal, but not disorganized, flexible but not simple. In fact, mobility can require more planning than staying in one place. You must know where food will be months in advance. You must carry or cache equipment. You must coordinate with other families. You must avoid exhausting local resources. You must remember routes, hazards, and agreements. You must teach children a map that exists not on paper, but in the mind. This is why the phrase "before cities" can be misleading. It sounds like before complexity, but cities are only one way humans became complex. They are one answer to the problem of organizing many people in one place. They are not the beginning of intelligence, creativity, trade, ritual, cooperation, or deep knowledge of the natural world. For tens of thousands of years, perhaps far longer, people made societies that were sophisticated precisely because they were adapted to movement, seasonality, and local environments. Their monuments may have been boats, their archives may have been songs, their architecture may have risen from timber and vanished back into soil. Their maps may have been carried in stories, their libraries may have lived in human memory. And because so much of that world was made from perishable things, we can mistake what is missing for what never existed. Then, eventually, in a few places, people began building in ways the earth could not so easily forget. But even stone does not guarantee memory. A monument can outlast the people who built it, yet still lose its name, its purpose, and the stories that gave it meaning. And a settlement built from mud brick, timber, reeds, and packed earth can vanish far more quickly. Sometimes it vanishes because people leave, sometimes because the landscape itself turns against them. Imagine a village beside a river. For generations, the river is life. It brings water, fish, fertile soil, reeds for roofs, easy travel, and a place where neighbouring communities can meet. Then one year the rains come too hard. The river rises beyond anything living people remember. It tears through fields, carries away houses, buries storage pits beneath silt, and leaves the survivors with almost nothing. That is one kind of disaster. But the opposite can be just as destructive. The rains fail. A river that once flooded predictably shrinks into disconnected pools. Crops wither, herd animals die or move away. Wells become crowded. Families begin leaving, first for a season, then permanently. The settlement does not need to be dramatically destroyed. It can simply become impossible to sustain. This is how climate change often works in human history, not as one giant switch being flipped, but as pressure. A few bad harvests, a longer dry season, colder winters, a coastline moving inland, a familiar animal migration arriving late, or not at all. Each change may be survivable by itself. Together, over years or generations, they can unravel the arrangements that kept a community alive. Food insecurity leads to migration. Migration brings strangers into territories already being used by others. Competition over water, farmland, grazing land, fishing grounds, or trade routes can lead to conflict. Crowded populations, malnutrition, and disrupted sanitation can make disease more dangerous. Conflict can destroy fields and interrupt trade. Disease can weaken labour forces just when people need to rebuild. A disaster is rarely only a disaster. It becomes a chain reaction. And this matters when we ask what could erase an advanced society from history. The answer is usually not that a single earthquake wipes every trace from the earth. Earthquakes destroy buildings, but they can also preserve them beneath collapsed walls. Volcanic eruptions can devastate landscapes, yet ash sometimes seals a moment in time with extraordinary detail. Floods can wash away settlements, but they also bury artifacts in sediments where they may survive for thousands of years. The danger is what comes afterward. A city damaged by an earthquake may recover if food still arrives. Rulers still command labour, trade routes remain open, and neighbouring communities are willing to help. But if the earthquake comes during drought, during war, during epidemic disease, or during political instability, recovery may fail. A town becomes a smaller town. A smaller town becomes a seasonal camp. Eventually, people stop repairing the walls, roofs collapse. Wood rots, fields return to scrub. Later generations may find only low mounds and scattered pottery, with no idea who once lived there. It is tempting to explain lost cultures with a single worldwide cataclysm. A flood that drowned everything, a volcano that ended civilization everywhere, a sudden impact that reset human history. Dramatic stories are powerful because they offer a simple answer to a complicated mystery. But the evidence usually points to something messier. Different regions experience different disasters. One valley dries while another becomes wetter. One coast is swallowed by rising seas, while inland communities expand. One kingdom collapses while its neighbours adapt. That does not make the losses less profound. In some ways it makes them more likely. A civilization does not have to be erased in one terrifying day. It can be worn down by repeated local catastrophes until there is no longer enough stability to rebuild. Think of a coastal settlement struck by storms every few decades. Each storm takes a few houses, damages boats, salinizes fields and forces people to move slightly inland. Then sea level rises slowly over centuries. The old harbour becomes a marsh. The cemetery is washed away. The trading beach disappears beneath water. Eventually the community relocates. Its descendants may preserve stories of an old place beneath the waves, but the physical evidence is now underwater, buried beneath sediment, difficult to find, and easy to overlook. Or picture a farming village on the edge of a dryland zone. It survives ordinary droughts because people have granaries, wells, kin in neighbouring settlements, and knowledge of wild foods. But then drought returns again and again. The granaries empty. Wells fail. Children become sick. Families scatter toward more reliable water. A generation later, the abandoned village is raided for timber and bricks by people facing the same shortages. Another generation later, wind covers the foundations. The place has not disappeared from history because nobody lived there. It has disappeared because too many people needed its materials, its land, or its water after it was abandoned. Human history may contain countless examples of this kind of gradual disappearance. Not a lost world destroyed by one impossible event, but communities repeatedly tested by climates that shifted, rivers that changed course, volcanoes that darkened skies, earthquakes that fractured homes, and diseases that moved along the same trade networks that once brought prosperity. And sometimes, under enough pressure, humanity itself seems to have narrowed to a dangerous point. Genetic research has suggested that ancient human ancestors may have passed through severe population bottlenecks, periods when our numbers fell dramatically and only scattered groups survived. The details remain debated. Estimates depend on complex models, incomplete fossils, and assumptions about ancient populations. But the larger lesson is difficult to escape. Our species has not always been numerous. There may have been times when survival depended on small communities finding refuge in a harsh, unstable world. Times when drought, changing habitats and dwindling resources did not merely threaten a city or a kingdom, but threatened entire human lineages. And yet some groups endured. They moved, they shared knowledge. They formed alliances, they adapted their tools, diets, and social systems to conditions that would have destroyed less flexible populations. The same forces that can erase settlements can also shape survivors into something more resilient, which means the silence beneath the surface is not only a record of failure, it is also a record of escape, and sometimes the survivors did more than escape. Sometimes before they had cities, before they had writing, before many of them had settled farming villages, they built monuments. In southeastern Turkey, on a hill called Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists uncovered something that forced history to become more complicated. Massive stone pillars, some weighing many tons, were arranged in circular and oval enclosures. Many were carved in the shape of stylized human figures, with arms, hands, belts, and fox fur garments. Around them appeared snakes, wild boar, vultures, spiders, birds, and other animals of the early Holocene landscape. The oldest structures date to roughly 9,600 BCE. That is more than 11,000 years ago, older than Stonehenge by thousands of years, older than the pyramids by even more. And most surprisingly, they were built at a time when the people of this region were still largely living by hunting, gathering, and managing wild resources. For a long time, the usual story went like this. First came agriculture. Agriculture produced surplus food. Surplus food allowed populations to grow. Larger populations created chiefs, priests, labor forces, and eventually monuments. Fields first, temples later. Göbekli Tepe suggested that the order was not always so simple. Here were communities without cities creating places that required planning, skilled stonework, cooperation, and the ability to bring many people together. Someone had to quarry the limestone. Someone had to shape the pillars. Someone had to organize food for workers and visitors. Someone had to decide which animals would be carved into stone, and what rituals would take place inside those strange enclosures. This does not mean Göbekli Tepe was built by a lost industrial civilization, or by some vanished global empire with secret technology. The tools were stone tools. The builders were people of their time, astonishingly capable, but not magically out of place. Nearby sites show a wider world of early communities experimenting with settlement, food production, ritual, and new forms of cooperation. Agriculture was beginning to emerge in the region, but it was not yet the settled agricultural world of later villages and cities. The real mystery is more interesting than the exaggerated one. Why did these people gather here? Was it a ritual center, a meeting place for scattered groups, a place for feasts, burials, ceremonies, alliances, or all of these at different times? We do not know. There are human remains, animal bones, tools, and traces of activity, but no written explanation. The stones survived. Their meaning did not. Then, after centuries of use, many of the enclosures were deliberately filled in with soil, rubble, broken stone, and debris, not simply abandoned and covered by time, but buried by human action. Perhaps this was a practical rebuilding decision. Perhaps it was ritual closure. Perhaps each enclosure had a life cycle, like a house, a grave, or a sacred object that eventually had to be put to rest. Whatever the reason, that burial helped preserve the site. Göbekli Tepe is a warning against easy stories. It shows that people we once imagined as simple hunter-gatherers could organize large projects, create powerful symbolic spaces, and reshape entire landscapes. But it also shows the limits of what archaeology can recover. We can measure pillars, we can date charcoal, we can study bones and stone tools. Yet the songs, arguments, beliefs, and names of the builders are gone. One discovery did not reveal a forgotten world civilization. It revealed something more unsettling. Our accepted narrative had been too narrow. And if Göbekli Tepe made the old story of civilization more complicated, the first true cities make it stranger still. Because a city looks permanent, walls of mud brick, temples rising above the plain, storehouses full of grain, markets, workshops, canals, priests, rulers, scribes, soldiers, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of people living in one concentrated place. To the people arriving from scattered villages, a city must have seemed almost invincible. A human-made mountain, a place too large, too organized, too important to disappear. But early cities were not invincible. They were fragile machines, held together by a few things that all had to keep working at once. Water had to arrive at the right time. Grain had to grow in sufficient quantities. Labourers had to maintain canals, walls, streets, and buildings. Trade had to bring in stone, timber, metals, and other materials unavailable on the flat river plains. And above all, people had to accept some kind of political order strong enough to coordinate thousands of lives. When that system worked, cities flourished. When one part failed, the whole structure could begin to unravel. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, gives us one of the clearest examples. This was where some of the earliest cities appeared more than 5,000 years ago. Places like Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, and later Babylon became centres of trade, religion, administration, and writing. They produced tablets, temples, laws, poems, tax records, royal inscriptions, and enough surviving evidence to make them seem unusually visible in the ancient world. But even here, where the record is richest, the story is not one long upward climb. It is a cycle: growth, strain, decline, abandonment, rebuilding. A city in southern Mesopotamia depended on irrigation. Rainfall was too unreliable for large-scale farming, so people dug canals and diverted river water into fields. This created enormous wealth. Grain harvests could feed specialists who were not farmers: potters, weavers, merchants, soldiers, builders, priests and scribes. Surplus food made cities possible, but irrigation had a hidden cost. River water carried small amounts of dissolved salt. In a hot, dry climate, water evaporated from the fields and left that salt behind. Year after year, century after century, the soil could become less productive. Farmers might switch from wheat, which is relatively sensitive to salt, to hardier barley. But eventually even barley struggled. Fields that had once fed a growing city could yield less and less. Imagine being a ruler whose city has doubled in size, whose temples need offerings, whose workers need rations, whose army needs supplies, and whose tax collectors are reporting smaller harvests every year. You can demand more labour. You can take more grain from farmers. You can fight your neighbours for better land. But none of that removes the salt already building beneath the surface. And the rivers themselves were never still. The Tigris and Euphrates shifted course, flooded unpredictably, cut new channels, and sometimes left old canals stranded far from the water they depended on. A city built beside a life-giving river could, over generations, find itself connected to a shrinking channel, a marsh, or dry land. Maintaining irrigation required constant labour, canals filled with silt. Levees broke, floods destroyed fields, droughts reduced the flow. Then there was trade. Mesopotamia had rich soil, but little timber, little building stone, and few metal ores. Cities depended on long-distance exchange networks reaching into Anatolia, Iran, the Persian Gulf, the Levant, and beyond. Copper, tin, cedar, stone shells, luxury goods and ideas moved along these routes. But trade routes are not permanent roads carved into the earth. They shift when kingdoms rise, ports decline, rivers move, warfare increases, or new routes become cheaper and safer. A city can survive a bad harvest. It can survive a damaged canal. It can even survive a war. But when harvests fall, water systems fail, trade weakens, and political order fractures at the same time, the city becomes something very different. Not a monument, a burden. People leave gradually at first. A family moves to a village with better fields. A merchant follows trade elsewhere. A workshop closes, a neighbourhood empties, the temple receives fewer offerings. Repairs stop, roofs collapse, rain cuts through mud-brick walls. Wind carries dust into streets that once echoed with carts, animals and voices. And then, later, people arrive. They do not necessarily see sacred ruins. They see useful material. Mud bricks can be dug out and reused. Fired bricks can be carried away for foundations, houses, walls, wells and roads. Timber vanishes. Metal is melted down, stone is taken. Even old burial grounds can be disturbed by farming, erosion, or new construction. A city may be dismantled piece by people who have no reason to preserve what it once was. Within a few centuries, an abandoned city can become a low mound in a field. In Mesopotamia, these mounds are called tells, built up from generations of mud brick buildings collapsing and being built over again. To an untrained eye, a tell may look like a natural hill. Underneath it could be streets, homes, workshops, temples, archives, and the accumulated lives of thousands of people. But only fragments survive: a broken seal, a grain jar, a tablet baked hard by an ancient fire, a wall foundation. The rest has returned to soil. So when we look at the ruins of early cities, we should not imagine that civilization is a thing that appears and simply remains. It is a process that has to be maintained every day. Water has to flow, fields have to produce, workers have to cooperate, rulers have to hold legitimacy, trade has to continue. Memory has to be preserved, and if those systems fail, even a city can become nearly invisible. Which raises a darker question. What happens when not one city fails, but an entire network of cities begins to break at once? For a few centuries, the Eastern Mediterranean had been doing something remarkable. It had become connected. Not connected in the modern sense, with instant messages and machines crossing oceans in hours. Connected by ships, caravans, royal marriages, merchant families, diplomatic gifts, and a constant movement of raw materials that kept entire kingdoms alive. Around 1200 BCE, a ruler in Mycenaean Greece could send a message to a king in Egypt. The king of Egypt might negotiate with the Hittite ruler in Anatolia. Cyprus exported copper. Somewhere, perhaps far beyond the eastern Mediterranean, tin was acquired and carried across dangerous routes. Mix copper and tin together, and you get bronze, the metal that gave the age its name. Bronze meant swords, spearheads, axes, tools, armour, vessels and status. But it also meant dependence. A kingdom might have fertile fields and skilled smiths, but no tin. Another might have timber, but no copper. A palace could control local farmers, but still need ships to bring in luxury goods, weapons, horses, ivory, glass, and the materials required to keep its elite economy running. This was a world of palaces. At Mycenae, Pylos, Knossos, Hattusa, Ugarit, Thebes, and Egypt's great administrative centres, scribes recorded rations, taxes, livestock, workers, land, textiles, and weapons. Rulers commanded labour, officials managed storehouses, specialists made perfumes, chariots, fine cloth, metal objects, and decorated pottery. Farmers grew the grain that supported everyone else. It was sophisticated, it was powerful, and like every other complex system, it was more fragile than it looked. Then, in the decades around 1200 BCE, much of it came apart. Palaces burned, cities were abandoned, trade routes weakened or vanished. In Greece, many of the great Mycenaean centres were destroyed or sharply reduced. The Hittite Empire, one of the superpowers of the age, disappeared from the political map. Ugarit, a wealthy port city on the Syrian coast, was destroyed and never rebuilt as the same kind of centre. Egypt survived but faced attacks, internal strain, and a long decline in its influence beyond the Nile Valley. For a long time, people wanted one dramatic answer. Maybe it was invasion. Ancient Egyptian records describe groups sometimes called the Sea Peoples, migrants and raiders who appeared in the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Egyptian pharaohs fought them. Some scholars have connected these groups to the destruction seen across the region. It is possible that armed migrants, displaced communities, pirates, or invading forces were part of the story. But that explanation alone is not enough. An invading army needs food. It needs ships, weapons, leadership, and somewhere to come from. And if large populations were moving, the next question becomes why? What had pushed them out of their homes? Drought may have been one answer. Climate evidence from parts of the Mediterranean suggests that the Late Bronze Age may have included periods of reduced rainfall. Not everywhere in exactly the same way, and not necessarily as one single uninterrupted drought, but enough to create real pressure. A few failed harvests could be devastating in a palace economy. Grain shortages mean hungry farmers. Hungry farmers mean unrest. Unrest means fewer taxes, fewer workers, and weaker armies. A kingdom already dependent on trade might find itself unable to buy food just when it needed it most. Then there was warfare. When resources become scarce, rulers do not always cooperate. They raid, they fortify, they demand more from their subjects. They fight over farmland, ports, and trade routes. A defeated kingdom can send refugees into neighbouring lands, spreading pressure outward like cracks running across ice. There may also have been rebellion from within. Palace systems concentrated wealth and power at the top. They required ordinary people to provide grain, labour, military service, and obedience. If the palace could no longer protect them, feed them, or justify its demands, people may have resisted, fled, or simply stopped cooperating. Archaeology cannot always tell us whether a burned palace was destroyed by foreign enemies, local rebels, or both. Fire leaves evidence of destruction. It does not leave a confession. And then trade itself began to fail. This is where the connected world became dangerous. A local village can sometimes survive by producing most of what it needs. A palace economy cannot. It depends on specialists. Specialists depend on food deliveries, armies depend on bronze. Bronze depends on copper and tin, merchants depend on safe routes and functioning ports. Ports depend on political stability. Political stability depends on rulers having enough food, wealth, and military power to keep control. Break one link, and the system might bend. Break several links at once, and the system can collapse with astonishing speed. This is why many scholars now favour what is sometimes called a systems collapse. Not one cause, not one enemy, not one bad year. A convergence of pressures, drought, famine, warfare, migration, rebellion, earthquakes in some places, and disruptions to trade. Each problem made the others worse. It was like a row of oil lamps in a crowded palace corridor. One goes out, then another. Then a gust of wind moves through, and suddenly the whole building is dark. The loss was not only political in many regions. Writing declined sharply. Mycenaean Greek had been written on clay tablets in a script we call Linear B. These tablets mostly recorded palace business, grain rations, sheep, workers, offerings, inventories. When the palaces fell, the scribes and their administrative system disappeared with them. For centuries afterward, Greece had no known writing system at all. Think about what that means. A generation had once kept records of land, taxes, labour, trade, and religious offerings. Then, perhaps within a few lifetimes, their descendants could no longer read the marks their grandparents had made. Specialised crafts declined too. Fine metalwork became harder when supply routes failed. Large-scale building projects stopped. Long-distance trade became smaller and more local. Some communities survived by becoming simpler, more flexible, less dependent on palace bureaucracy and imported materials. That was not the end of people. It was the end of a particular way of organising people. Farmers remained, fishers remained, shepherds remained. Small towns and villages continued. New societies emerged from the wreckage. But the old world of international palace kingdoms, diplomatic letters, imported luxuries, and tightly managed economies had fractured, and later generations remembered it only imperfectly. Greek stories preserved shadows of a great age of heroes, rich kings, ships, wars, and cities with high walls. The tales of Troy may contain distant echoes of the Bronze Age world, mixed with centuries of retelling, invention, and myth. But the people telling those stories did not possess a clear archive of what had happened. They inherited ruins, names, songs, and fragments. They remembered a world that had been larger than their own. They remembered that something had been lost, and that may be the most unsettling part. Even a civilization with writing, trade, armies, palaces, and international diplomacy can lose the ability to explain its own past. The records can burn, the scribes can vanish, the language can fall silent. Then history does not disappear completely. It becomes a rumour. A rumour is still something, but rumours change. They shrink. They grow. They turn kings into giants, wars into battles between gods, and complicated political disasters into a single night when everything was lost. Writing seems like the obvious defence against that kind of forgetting. Put the words on a tablet, a scroll, a piece of bark, a sheet of papyrus, and surely they can survive longer than a human memory. Sometimes they can, but writing is not memory by itself. Writing is a system, and systems need people to keep them alive. A text needs someone who knows how to make the material it is written on, someone who knows the script, someone who understands the language, someone who can teach the next generation. It needs buildings dry enough to protect it, institutions rich enough to maintain it, and communities stable enough to care that it survives. Take away any of those things, and a written record can become useless surprisingly fast. Imagine finding a book written in a language nobody speaks, using letters nobody can read, stored in a library nobody knows exists. The words are still physically there, but the knowledge is gone, or nearly gone. This happened over and over again. In the ancient world, most writing was not carved into stone. Stone inscriptions survive because stone is stubborn, but everyday records were usually made on materials that were much less stubborn: papyrus wood, leather, wax tablets, bamboo, cloth, palm leaves, bark, parchment, things that burn, rot, dissolve, get eaten by insects, or simply fall apart when nobody copies them anymore. And copying was everything. Before printing, a text survived only if someone made another copy, and then another, and another. Every generation had to decide that an old work was worth the labour. If a monastery closed, if a court lost its funding, if a school stopped teaching a language, thousands of texts could quietly vanish without any dramatic fire at all. Neglect can destroy a library just as completely as conquest. Fire, of course, helped. We remember famous stories of libraries burning because they are so powerful. The Library of Alexandria has become almost a symbol for all lost knowledge. But its destruction was not necessarily one single apocalyptic event. The institution seems to have declined through a series of wars, political changes, religious conflicts, and losses over centuries. That makes the story less cinematic, maybe, but also more frightening. Knowledge does not always vanish in one great blaze. Sometimes it disappears shelf by shelf. A funding cut, a war, a new ruler with different priorities, a scholar dying before training an apprentice, a damp roof, a language becoming unfashionable, a population fleeing a city, one missing copy followed by another. Then one day, people discover that an entire way of thinking has slipped beyond reach. And conquest can speed this process up brutally. When armies sack cities, archives are often not their first priority. They are looking for wealth, food, captives, weapons, political enemies. Clay tablets, scrolls, temple records, and tax accounts may be burned, scattered, looted, or left exposed to rain. Sometimes rulers deliberately destroy records because records preserve the authority of the people they conquered. Sometimes they censor books because ideas can threaten power as effectively as armies. If you're enjoying this descent into the strange gaps in human history, the channel's book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website with the link in the description. Because the deeper you look into the past, the more you realize that some of the biggest mysteries are not hidden in fantasy. They're hidden in what nobody bothered or was able to preserve. But here is the strange part. Fire does not always erase writing. The Linear B tablets from Mycenae and Greece survived precisely because the palaces burned. They were made of unfired clay, probably intended for temporary administrative use. In normal conditions, water would eventually have softened them back into mud. But when the palaces went up in flames, the heat baked the tablets hard. Disaster accidentally preserved the final paperwork of a civilization. We can read those tablets today. We know about sheep, grain, workers, perfumes, sacrifices, chariots, and officials. But we mostly see the palace's last surviving receipts. We do not have their epics, their private letters, their jokes, their arguments, their medical advice, or the stories ordinary people told their children. What survives can create a distorted picture. A society may have been full of poets, engineers, merchants, navigators, priests, healers, and teachers. But if only tax records survive, it can look like a civilization made entirely of grain quotas and livestock inventories. And sometimes even the records survive, but we cannot read them. Linear A, used on Crete before Linear B, remains undeciphered. We can recognize signs, we can count them, we can identify repeated patterns, and perhaps guess at administrative functions. But we do not know the language behind most of it. The people who wrote it are not completely silent. Their marks are still there, but they are speaking through a locked door. The Indus script presents a similar problem. Thousands of short inscriptions survive on seals, pottery, and small objects from one of the ancient world's great urban civilizations. Yet no widely accepted decipherment exists. We can see the symbols, we can trace where they appeared, but we cannot confidently hear the voices behind them. That silence matters. Without readable texts, archaeologists have to reconstruct a civilization from streets, drains, workshops, graves, food remains, trade goods, and broken walls. Those things can tell us an astonishing amount, but they cannot easily tell us what people call themselves, what laws they debated, what songs they sang, what fears kept them awake at night, or what they believed happened after death. A lost script does not mean a people had nothing to say. It means we have lost the key, but not all knowledge depends on books. Oral traditions can survive where archives fail, a song can carry genealogy. A ritual can preserve seasonal knowledge, a story can remember a flood, a migration, a volcanic eruption, an old boundary, or the name of a place long after the buildings are gone. Indigenous communities around the world have preserved detailed environmental and historical knowledge through oral transmission across many generations. Of course, oral memory changes too. It is shaped by performance, belief, politics, and the needs of the present. But written records change as well. They are copied badly, edited, censored, translated, and interpreted by people with their own agendas. Neither writing nor memory is perfect. Both are fragile bridges thrown across time. And when the scribes vanish, when libraries decay, when scripts become unreadable, later generations may look back at the ruins and assume the people who built them were simpler than they really were. Not because those people lacked knowledge, because their knowledge lost its voice. And few civilizations have been trapped behind a more misleading silence than the Maya. For a long time, people looked at enormous stone cities rising from the forests of southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras, and imagined a mystery so complete it bordered on the supernatural. Temples stood empty. Palaces were swallowed by roots. Stelae covered in writing had been broken, buried, or worn smooth by rain. How could people build places like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, and Caracol, then simply disappear? The answer is, they didn't. The ancient Maya cities did not vanish in the sense that their population was wiped from the earth. Maya people are still here, millions of them. They speak dozens of Maya languages, maintain living traditions, farm the same broad region their ancestors knew, and preserve identities that survived conquest, epidemics, forced conversion, civil war, and centuries of outsiders declaring them gone. What collapsed was not the Maya themselves. What collapsed in many places was a particular political world. During what archaeologists call the Classic period, roughly from 250 to 900 CE, much of the Maya lowlands was filled with competing kingdoms. These were not one unified empire ruled from a single capital. They were networks of city-states, each with its own royal dynasty, alliances, enemies, rituals, monuments, and ambitions. A king in one city might be married into the ruling family of another. Two cities might trade jade, obsidian, cacao, feathers, salt, and ceramics for generations. Then a dispute over tribute, territory, prisoners, or royal legitimacy could turn those same neighbours into enemies. Their history was written in stone. Maya rulers raised carved monuments, recording coronations, wars, captives, marriages, victories, and anniversaries in the vast cycles of their calendar. For centuries, the monuments tell a story of dense political competition. Cities rising, dynasties boasting, victories being remembered in public stone. Then, especially in the southern lowlands, something changed. By the late 8th and 9th centuries, many great cities stopped raising dated monuments. Royal courts weakened, construction slowed, palaces were abandoned. Populations declined or moved away. In some places, political authority seems to have fractured rapidly. A city that had supported tens of thousands of people could become a much smaller settlement within a few generations. It is tempting to ask for one cause, one final disaster. One answer neat enough to fit on a stone plaque. But history is rarely that generous. Drought appears to have been a major pressure. Climate records from lake sediments, cave formations, and other environmental evidence suggest that parts of the Maya region experienced repeated severe dry periods during the centuries of decline. The lowland Maya depended heavily on seasonal rain. Many major centres had no large rivers nearby. They collected water in reservoirs, managed wetlands, built terraces, and engineered landscapes with extraordinary skill. But even an advanced system has limits. A few dry years can be difficult. A sequence of dry decades, arriving when population is high, forests have been cleared, soils are stressed, and rival kingdoms are already fighting, can become a political catastrophe. Think about what drought does to a kingdom built around divine rulers. Harvests fail, reservoirs shrink, food prices rise. Farmers leave the countryside or become desperate. Armies are harder to feed, trade becomes less reliable. A king who claimed to maintain cosmic order now has to explain why the rains have stopped. And meanwhile his enemies are facing the same crisis. Warfare likely intensified in some regions. Archaeologists have found evidence of fortifications, defensive walls, burned buildings, disrupted settlements, and shifting patterns of occupation. Some cities may have been attacked directly. Others may have suffered from the slow destruction of the systems that connected them. Trade routes breaking down, tribute failing to arrive, allies becoming rivals, local leaders refusing the demands of distant courts. Political fragmentation can be as destructive as invasion. A city does not need to be burned to the ground to collapse. It only needs to stop functioning as a city. The officials leave. The markets shrink. The reservoirs are no longer maintained. The farmers move closer to reliable water. The people who know how to organize labour, repair canals, carve monuments, and support a royal court lose the resources to keep doing it. Then the forest begins its patient work. In the humid tropics, abandoned stone does not remain exposed for long. Seeds fall into cracks. Moss grows across plaster. Trees rise through courtyards. Roots push apart walls that took thousands of workers to build. Over centuries, temples become hills. Causeways vanish under soil. Reservoirs fill with sediment and reeds. To later outsiders, the jungle can make it seem as if the cities were never there at all. But the jungle did not erase the Maya overnight. It concealed abandoned buildings while Maya communities continued living across the region. And while some southern lowland capitals declined, other Maya centers remained active. Cities in northern Yucatan, including Chichen Itza and later Mayapan, became major powers in different eras. Coastal trade continued. Maya-speaking communities adapted to new rulers, new economies, and changing landscapes. The ending was not one ending, it was a long series of regional transformations. Some royal dynasties disappeared, some cities emptied. Some political systems failed, but people survived, moved, rebuilt, traded, remembered, and changed. That distinction matters because ruins can lie to us. When we see an empty temple emerging from a forest, we naturally imagine a dead civilization. But an abandoned capital is not the same thing as an extinct people. A fallen government is not the same thing as cultural disappearance. Even the loss of a writing tradition or a royal court does not mean that knowledge, language, family, ritual, and memory have vanished. The Maya case gives us a quieter and more realistic picture of collapse. Civilizations do not always end with everybody gone. Sometimes the palaces fall silent, while villages continue. Sometimes kings disappear while languages endure. Sometimes the monumental world is abandoned, covered by trees, and mistaken for a mystery, while the descendants of its builders are still living nearby, carrying history in forms that stone alone cannot preserve. And on the other side of the world, another forest was hiding a similar lesson. For centuries, travellers who reached Cambodia saw the stone temples of Angkor rising from the jungle, towers shaped like lotus buds, faces carved into stone, long galleries covered in battles, processions, gods, and kings. Angkor Wat was so enormous, so carefully built, that it seemed impossible to miss. But even Angkor Wat was only part of the story. The ancient Khmer capital was not just a temple complex surrounded by empty forest. At its height, between roughly the 9th and 15th centuries, Angkor was the centre of one of the most powerful states in Southeast Asia, and the city around it may have spread across an astonishingly large area. Not a city in the modern sense, with blocks of high buildings packed tightly together. Angkor was something different, a vast low-density urban landscape. Temples, royal compounds, rice fields, ponds, embankments, canals, shrines, villages, roads, and wooden houses spread across the plain. People lived among waterworks and farms, connected to ceremonial centres by raised roads and canals. It was a city built not against water, but around it. Cambodia has dramatic wet and dry seasons. During the monsoon, rain can fall with overwhelming force. Rivers swell, fields flood. Then, months later, the dry season arrives and water becomes precious again. The Khmer response was one of the most ambitious landscape engineering projects in the pre-modern world. They dug canals. They built enormous reservoirs called barais. They raised embankments across the flat land. They created channels that could move water through the city and into agricultural fields. The system probably helped with irrigation in some areas, though archaeologists still debate exactly how every part worked. It also controlled floods, stored water, supported transport, and made the whole landscape more productive. Angkor was not simply placed in the forest, it remade the forest. For a long time, though, the full scale of that remaking was hard to see. Thick tropical vegetation covered the ground. Centuries of leaf litter and soil softened old roads into gentle ridges. Canals filled with sediment. Wooden houses vanished almost completely. From the ground, it was possible to walk through the trees and see very little. A low mound, a strange straight line, a shallow depression full of water. Then new technology began to change the map. Researchers used LiDAR, a method that sends millions of laser pulses down from aircraft. Some pulses strike leaves and branches, others pass through gaps in the canopy and reach the ground. When the vegetation is digitally removed, the shape of the landscape beneath begins to appear. And what appeared around Angkor was extraordinary. Beneath forests that had seemed largely empty were traces of roads, ponds, embankments, canals, temple sites, and dense patterns of settlement. LiDAR did not reveal a lost city in the fantasy sense. It revealed something more interesting, evidence that the visible monuments were embedded in a much larger inhabited world. Places once treated as isolated temples turned out to be connected to extensive landscapes of human activity. At some sites beyond the main Angkor region, LiDAR revealed carefully planned grids and urban layouts beneath the trees. The forest had not preserved empty wilderness around the temples. It had covered the remains of communities, infrastructure and land management systems that had become difficult to recognize from the ground. This is what makes tropical archaeology so humbling. Stone survives sometimes. Wood usually does not. The ordinary homes of most people at Angkor were likely built from timber, bamboo, thatch, and other materials that rot quickly in heat and moisture. Roads made from packed earth can be washed down by rain, cut by roots, or buried beneath centuries of sediment. Bridges collapse. Canals become marshes. Rice fields return to scrub and woodland. Within a few generations, a maintained landscape can begin to look natural again. Give it a few hundred years, and even a major city can become difficult to see. But why did Angkor change? Again, there is no single answer everyone agrees on. Environmental strain seems to have mattered. The water system that made Angkor powerful also required constant maintenance. Canals had to be cleared, embankments had to be repaired. Reservoirs had to be managed. A system built to handle seasonal extremes could become vulnerable when those extremes became too severe. Climate evidence suggests that the region experienced major swings in rainfall during the 14th and 15th centuries. Long droughts may have been interrupted by intense monsoon floods. Imagine the problem. During drought, reservoirs shrink and crops suffer. Then heavy rains arrive, tearing through channels, damaging earthworks, and carrying sediment into the very infrastructure needed to manage water. Archaeologists have found signs of erosion and damage in parts of Angkor's water network. That does not prove climate alone brought down the city, but it suggests a complicated system under real pressure, and the political world was changing too. Khmer rulers had once controlled wide territories through military power, religious authority, tribute, and control of labour. But power can shift outward as well as collapse inward. New political centres emerged. Rivals challenged Khmer influence. Maritime trade became increasingly important in Southeast Asia, drawing wealth and attention toward coastal routes and river ports. Angkor sat inland. As trade networks shifted, the advantages of controlling a great inland ceremonial capital may have changed. Some populations moved toward the region around Phnom Penh, where river connections offered easier access to expanding trade across the Gulf of Thailand, the South China Sea, and beyond. So Angkor was not simply abandoned in one terrifying night. Its central role weakened, its population changed. Royal investment moved. Waterworks were no longer maintained at the same scale. Some parts of the vast urban landscape may have thinned out long before the final political transition. By the 15th century, the old capital had lost much of its former importance, even though Angkor Wat and other temples continued to be used, visited, adapted, and remembered. Cambodia did not disappear. The Khmer people did not disappear. What changed was the structure that had held together one enormous inland capital, one particular system of kingship, water management, labour, and ritual power. And then the forest did what forests do. It grew across roads. It filled canals. It hid villages. It wrapped roots around stone walls and made a human landscape look ancient, empty, almost mythical, until LiDAR looked through the leaves and showed that the emptiness was an illusion. That is the deeper lesson of Angkor. Sometimes history has not been erased because people were primitive, or because their cities were small, or because nothing remains. Sometimes it has been hidden by rain, roots, wood rot, changing rivers, and the simple fact that we were looking at the wrong layer of the landscape. The city was there all along. We just could not see it. And sometimes history is not hidden beneath trees. Sometimes it is hidden in plain sight, beneath the streets of modern cities, beneath fields that have been ploughed for thousands of years, beneath river plains where mud, brick and floodwater keep covering the past one thin layer at a time. In what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, archaeologists uncovered the remains of another ancient urban world, a civilization that was building planned cities while the pyramids were rising in Egypt and the first kingdoms of Mesopotamia were competing along the Tigris and Euphrates. We call it the Indus civilization or the Harappan civilization, after the site of Harappa, one of the first major cities identified by modern archaeology. At its height, roughly between 2600 and 1900 BCE, it covered an enormous area. Settlements linked to this civilization stretched across the Indus River basin, and far beyond it, from the mountains near Afghanistan to the Arabian Sea, and eastward toward the plains of northern India. This was not one city, not one kingdom with a single obvious capital. It was a network of cities, towns, villages, farming communities, workshops, ports and trading stations, spread across a territory larger than many later Bronze Age states. And its cities were astonishingly organized. Take Mohenjo-Daro, located beside the Indus River in present-day Sindh. Its streets were laid out in straight lines, often crossing at right angles. Houses were built from standardized baked bricks. Wells appeared throughout the city, giving many neighborhoods access to water. Some homes had bathing areas with carefully made floors and drains. Then there was the drainage system. This is one of the details that makes the Indus cities feel strangely modern. Wastewater channels ran beneath streets, often covered with removable brick slabs. Drains from individual houses fed into larger public drains. Settling pits may have helped trap solid material before it entered the wider system. This was not glamorous architecture. No giant statue declaring the greatness of a king. No enormous victory inscription carved into stone. It was infrastructure, the kind of infrastructure that only works when thousands of people follow shared rules. Bricks need to be made to the same proportions. Streets need to be planned before houses fill them. Drains need to be cleaned. Water needs to move somewhere. People need agreements, institutions, labour systems, and probably officials or community authorities capable of making the whole machine function. And the same sense of order appears across huge distances. Archaeologists have found standardized weights made from carefully shaped stone at sites hundreds of miles apart. The weight system was remarkably consistent. A merchant in one city could apparently measure goods, using the same basic standards as a merchant far away. That tells us trade was not improvised. It was organized. Indus people traded stone, metals, shell, ivory, timber, beads, cotton textiles, and other goods across their own vast region. They also traded with Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian texts mention a distant place called Meluha, which many scholars think was connected to the Indus world. Indus-style seals and goods have been found in Mesopotamian contexts, while materials from Western Asia reached Indus cities. So imagine the scale of coordination required. Farmers producing grain and cotton, craftspeople drilling tiny stone beads with extraordinary precision, traders moving cargo down rivers and across the sea, builders producing millions of bricks, communities maintaining wells, drains, streets, and storage areas. And yet, for all this organization, we do not know what they called themselves. We do not know the names of their rulers, if they had rulers in the way Egypt or Mesopotamia did. We do not know their myths, their laws, their arguments, their songs, their prayers, or the ordinary gossip of a marketplace at sunset, because their writings still cannot be read. Thousands of short inscriptions survive, often on small carved seals. They show animals, symbols, and brief sequences of signs. A horned bull-like creature, an elephant, a rhinoceros. A seated figure, tiny marks arranged above them with careful repetition. But the script remains undeciphered. Part of the problem is brutal and simple. The texts are short, most contain only a few signs. There is no known bilingual inscription, no Indus equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, no long royal decree that can be compared with a language we already understand. Researchers have proposed many possibilities. Some think the script recorded a language related to early Dravidian languages. Others have suggested different linguistic families, or questioned whether all the signs represent writing in the full conventional sense. There is no consensus, and without reading those messages, certainty stops at the city gate. We can measure their bricks, we can trace their trade routes, we can map their streets, we can analyze the chemicals in their beads, and the grains in their storage jars. But we cannot ask them why a seal was made, what a symbol meant, who owned a warehouse, or what people believed was happening to their world as their cities changed. Then, around 1900 BCE, that world began to transform. Not necessarily collapse all at once, not in a single invasion, fire, earthquake, or final battle. The great cities of the mature Indus tradition declined in population and importance. Long-distance trade appears to have weakened. Standardized systems became less widespread. Some urban centers were abandoned or reduced. Settlement patterns shifted, with many communities moving toward eastern and southern regions. Why, again? The answer is probably not one thing. Climate changes may have reduced or disrupted the monsoon rains that agriculture depended on. River systems changed course over time, sometimes gradually, sometimes violently. Flooding affected some Indus settlements, while other regions may have faced increasing dryness. The exact history of particular rivers, especially those associated with the Gaga-Hakra region, remains debated. But the broader reality is clear enough. These communities lived in a landscape where rivers were lifelines, and lifelines can move. A city built beside water can become vulnerable when water arrives too strongly, too weakly, or somewhere else entirely. As environmental pressures changed, people adapted. They did not simply vanish. Many communities continued in smaller settlements. Farming traditions continued. Craft traditions continued. Populations moved and reorganized. The Indus civilization did not disappear like a light switching off. Its great urban system fragmented, and because its script is still silent, we do not know how the people themselves understood that transformation. Maybe they saw droughts, maybe failed harvests, maybe rivers abandoning familiar channels. Maybe political conflict, economic strain, or the slow unravelling of trade networks that had once connected cities across a continent. Or maybe they saw none of those things as a collapse at all. Maybe they saw families leaving old cities and building new lives where water, soil, and opportunity still remained. That is the strange power of the Indus civilization. It was advanced enough to build cities with drains, standards, trade networks, and remarkable technical skill. It was organized enough to leave a pattern visible across an immense landscape. But its own voice remains locked behind a few hundred tiny signs. Not erased completely, just unread. But unread messages are not the only way a civilization can lose its voice. Sometimes the evidence is clear enough. The walls are still standing. The roads can still be traced. The objects are still in the ground. And people simply refuse to believe what they are looking at. In the highlands of southern Africa, in what is now Zimbabwe, there stands the largest ancient stone complex south of the Sahara Desert. It is called Great Zimbabwe. The name comes from a Shona phrase often translated as houses of stone, and for centuries that is exactly what it was. A vast political and economic centre built among granite hills, with dry stone walls rising in graceful curves, some more than 30 feet high, fitted together without mortar. No cement, no concrete, no imported engineers from Europe or the Middle East, just local stone, local knowledge, and generations of skilled labour. Great Zimbabwe began to grow around the 11th century CE. By the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries, it had become the centre of a powerful kingdom. At its height, the wider settlement may have supported many thousands of people, perhaps as many as 10,000 to 20,000, though estimates vary. This was not a lonely fortress in the wilderness, it was a city. There were elite compounds built among the granite outcrops of the hill complex. There were residential areas spreading across the valley below. There were workshops, storage spaces, livestock enclosures, pathways and homes, made from earth, wood and thatch, the kinds of structures that decay much faster than stone. And then there was the great enclosure. This is the structure most people remember. A huge elliptical wall built from carefully stacked granite blocks curves through the landscape like something grown rather than constructed. In some places it is more than 800 feet around. Inside stands a mysterious conical tower, nearly 30 feet tall, built solid from stone. Nobody knows exactly what the tower meant. It may have had ritual significance. It may have been connected to authority, status, fertility, grain storage symbolism, or political power. Archaeologists can describe its shape, its location, its construction. But the people who built it did not leave us an explanation carved into a tablet. Still, we know enough to understand the basic reality. Great Zimbabwe was deeply connected to trade. Its rulers controlled access to gold-producing regions in the surrounding plateau. Gold moved outward along trade routes that linked inland southern Africa to the Swahili port cities of the Indian Ocean coast. From there, goods travelled to Arabia, Persia, India, and China. Archaeologists have found imported glass beads at Great Zimbabwe, Chinese porcelain, Persian pottery, coins from the Kilwa Sultanate on the East African coast. These objects did not appear there by accident. They are evidence of a connected world. Picture caravans carrying gold, ivory, cattle products, and other goods toward the coast. Picture merchants at ports on the Indian Ocean loading cargo onto dhows. Picture beads made in South Asia or Southeast Asia, passing from trader to trader until they reached a stone city hundreds of miles inland. Great Zimbabwe was not isolated from global history. It was part of it. And yet, when European explorers and settlers encountered its ruins in the 19th century, many could not accept that conclusion. The stone walls were too impressive, they said. The trade goods seemed too distant. The scale of the site seemed too ambitious, so they invented other builders. Some claimed Great Zimbabwe had been built by Phoenicians. Others proposed ancient Egyptians, Arabs, Romans, or the biblical followers of King Solomon. One popular fantasy connected the site to the Queen of Sheba and the gold mines described in the Bible. Anything, apparently, except the people whose descendants lived nearby. This was not an innocent mistake. It was colonial racism working like a machine. European settlers wanted land, mineral wealth, and political control in southern Africa. Acknowledging that local African societies had built major stone cities, managed trade networks, and ruled complex states would have challenged the story colonialism needed to tell. The story was simple. Africa had no real history before Europeans arrived. Africa had no builders, no states, no civilization worth respecting. Therefore, conquest could be presented not as theft but as improvement. Great Zimbabwe stood there, physically contradicting that lie. So the lie had to explain Great Zimbabwe away. By the early 20th century, archaeologists began demonstrating what local people had always known. The site was built by African ancestors, most likely Shona-speaking communities connected to the broader cultural traditions of the region. Excavations found no evidence for a lost Mediterranean colony or a biblical mining expedition. Then, in 1929, archaeologist Gertrude Caton Thompson conducted more systematic work and concluded clearly that Great Zimbabwe was of local African origin. The evidence was there. But evidence does not automatically defeat ideology. For decades, the white minority government of Rhodesia continued to suppress or distort the site's African history. Official narratives resisted the conclusion because the conclusion was politically dangerous. If African people had built Great Zimbabwe, then the claim that white rule had brought civilization to the region became much harder to maintain. Think about what that means. The civilization was not buried by ash. Its walls were not drowned beneath the sea. Its writing was not lost in a library fire. Its ruins were visible, and still its history was nearly erased. Not through destruction, through interpretation. That is one of the most unsettling lessons in this entire story. The past does not only disappear when buildings collapse or documents rot. It can disappear when powerful people decide that certain ancestors could not possibly have been capable of greatness. A ruin can survive for 800 years and still be made invisible. Not because nobody saw it, because too many people looked at it and refused to understand. And nowhere is that lesson more important than in the Americas. For a long time, popular history presented the continents before European arrival as a vast, mostly empty wilderness. Endless forest, open prairie, small scattered bands of people living lightly on land untouched by human hands. Then Europeans arrived, brought farms, towns, roads, and civilization. It is a comforting story, if you want conquest, to look inevitable. It is also wrong, not wrong, because every part of the Americas was covered in cities. It wasn't. These were enormous continents filled with deserts, mountains, forests, grasslands, coasts, and river systems. Human societies adapted to each place in radically different ways. But from the Arctic to Patagonia, people had been reshaping landscapes, building political systems, developing crops, moving goods across great distances, and creating cities long before 1492. The Americas were not empty, they were full of worlds. In central Mexico, cities like Teotihuacan had risen centuries before the Aztec Empire. In the Andes, the Inca built roads across mountains that still make modern engineers pause. The Maya created powerful city-states, monumental architecture, and one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the ancient world. But complexity did not only exist in the famous places. North of the Maya world, along the Mississippi River floodplain near what is now St. Louis. There once stood one of the largest cities in North America. Its name was Cahokia. Around 1050 CE, Cahokia began expanding with astonishing speed. Within a few generations, it had become a major urban centre, organised around vast public plazas and enormous earthen mounds. At its heart stood Monk's Mound, a colossal platform built from basket after basket of soil. It still rises nearly 100 feet above the surrounding ground. Think about the labour involved. No metal shovels, no draft animals pulling wagons, no concrete mixers. People dug earth, carried it, piled it, shaped it, repaired it, and built again. At its height, Cahokia may have held tens of thousands of people in the city and its surrounding settlements, although exact population estimates remain debated. Whatever the final number, this was not a village that accidentally got large. It was a planned centre of power. There were neighbourhoods, markets, craft specialists, religious spaces, defensive walls, storage areas, political elites, farmers living in the productive countryside beyond the city growing maize and supporting a dense population. Cahokia eventually declined after the 13th century, probably through some combination of environmental strain, political instability, shifting trade networks, conflict, and climate change. Archaeologists are still debating the precise balance. But its disappearance from daily memory was helped by another force. Later generations built over parts of it. Modern roads cut through it. Urban development erased mounds that had survived for centuries. An ancient city sat beside an American city, and much of it was flattened before anyone understood what was being lost. Now go south into the Amazon. For centuries, outsiders looked at the rainforest and saw untouched nature. A green ocean without history, a place supposedly too hostile for large, complex societies. But the forest has been answering back. Archaeologists, using satellite mapping, aerial laser scanning, soil studies and excavation, have identified networks of earthworks, raised fields, roads, canals, geometric enclosures, and planned settlements across parts of Amazonia. In some regions, people created dark, fertile soils known as terra preta, enriched with charcoal, food waste, pottery fragments, and organic material. These soils can remain productive for centuries. They are not a natural accident. They are evidence of deliberate landscape management. Other communities built mounds in floodplains, dug ponds, planted orchards, managed forests for useful species, and shaped waterways to make seasonal environments more reliable. The Amazon was not one thing. Some areas may indeed have supported small, mobile communities. Others supported dense, settled populations and large regional networks. The scale is still being argued over, site by site, valley by valley. But the old image of a pristine wilderness, with almost no human history, is becoming harder to defend. In many places, the forest people encountered was not untouched. It was a living archive of human decisions. Then came contact. And contact was not a single event. It was a wave moving unevenly across two continents. Ships arrived, traders arrived, missionaries arrived, soldiers arrived, settlers arrived, and often disease arrived first. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and other infections spread through populations with no prior exposure. In some regions, the death toll was catastrophic. Communities lost elders, farmers, leaders, healers, children, and the people who carried oral histories and practical knowledge. The exact scale varied widely, and scholars continue to debate population estimates before contact. But there is no serious doubt about the larger pattern. The Americas experienced one of the greatest demographic disasters in human history. Then conquest deepened the damage. Land was seized. People were displaced. Survivors were forced into labour systems, missions, reservations, and colonial towns. Fields were abandoned, managed forests changed, old roads vanished beneath new ones. When later European settlers looked across landscapes emptied by disease and violence, they sometimes mistook the aftermath for the original condition. They saw fewer people, and concluded there had always been fewer people. That mistake shaped history for centuries, but archaeology keeps revising the picture. Every new survey, every buried village, every ancient field system, every patch of human-made soil reminds us that absence can be misleading. A landscape can look wild, not because nobody lived there, but because the people who shaped it were devastated, displaced, and written out of the story. And that brings us to one of the deepest problems in all of archaeology. Even when a civilization survives in ruins, most of the people who lived there are still missing. Not just their names, their meals, their clothes, their jokes, their arguments, the songs they sang while grinding grain or rowing boats, the smell of their homes after rain, the exact words parents used to comfort frightened children, the techniques a potter learned from her mother, the knowledge a farmer carried in his hands, knowing when a river was about to rise, which seed would survive a dry year, which wild plant could heal a fever. Almost all of it disappears. Think about the materials that make up ordinary life. Wood rots, cloth decays, leather dries out, cracks, and is eaten by bacteria. Food is consumed, burned, scattered, or decomposed. Paper turns to pulp. Baskets collapse. Rope vanishes. Reed houses, wooden bridges, market stalls, fishing nets, toys, furniture, tools with wooden handles, all the small useful things people made and touched every day, usually return to the soil. And human voices vanish even faster. A voice leaves no fossil. A language may survive if someone writes it down, but for most of human history, people did not write. They passed knowledge through stories, songs, rituals, demonstrations, and memory. If a community is scattered, conquered, or devastated by disease, an entire library can disappear without a single book ever burning. The people are gone, and the knowledge that lived inside them goes too. This is why archaeology can feel almost unfair. The past does not preserve itself evenly. It chooses, or rather chemistry chooses, what gets to remain. Most places are terrible for preservation. Warm, wet soil is especially destructive. Microbes thrive there, insects feed, roots push through old layers. Oxygen helps organic materials break down. Give a wooden house a few centuries in the wrong environment, and it may leave nothing more than a faint stain in the earth where posts once stood. But occasionally, conditions become strangely perfect. In a desert, extreme dryness can halt decay. Ancient textiles, wooden furniture, baskets, and even food have survived for thousands of years in the dry tombs of Egypt, Peru, and Western China. In ice, cold slows the organisms that consume flesh and fibre. Frozen bodies can preserve clothing, tools, tattoos, and the last meals people ate before they died. Peat bogs can preserve human remains in an even more unsettling way. The acidic, oxygen-poor water prevents normal decay. Some bog bodies still have skin, hair, fingerprints, and expressions on their faces, long after the societies that placed them there have vanished. Waterlogged soil can do something similar. When wood is buried beneath water and cut off from oxygen, it may survive for centuries or even millennia. Ancient wells, shipwrecks, harbour structures, wooden tablets, and household objects sometimes emerge from mud looking almost recent. But these are exceptions. They are not the normal past. They are lucky accidents, and because they are rare, they can distort our understanding. We may know astonishing details about one person preserved in a bog, while knowing almost nothing about thousands of ordinary people who lived in the same century under less fortunate conditions. Meanwhile, stone survives. Stone temples, stone tombs. Stone walls, stone statues, stone inscriptions. The things built by kings, priests, elites, and institutions have a much better chance of reaching us than the things built by everyone else. This means the archaeological record is biased toward power. A palace may survive while the homes of the workers who built it vanish. A royal inscription may survive while the language spoken in nearby villages is lost. A giant tomb can tell us what rulers wanted to be remembered for, but not necessarily what their subjects believed, feared, ate, or dreamed about. We inherit the monuments, and then too easily mistake them for the whole civilization. But every pyramid had quarry workers, every temple had cooks, farmers, rope makers, stone cutters, midwives, porters, carpenters, and people repairing roofs before the next storm. Every great city depended on countless practical skills that rarely leave clear traces. How did they make a dye that did not fade? How did they weave cloth fine enough to pass through a ring? How did they build boats from local timber without written plans? How did they predict weather, manage soil, preserve food, train animals, treat wounds, or navigate by stars? Sometimes we can reconstruct fragments of these skills from tools, residues, experimental archaeology, surviving communities, and written descriptions. But much of it is gone. A broken pot tells us that pottery existed. It does not automatically tell us who mixed the clay, how they learned the firing temperature, what songs they used to remember the process, or how many failed attempts were required before a young apprentice got it right. Technology is not just objects, technology is memory. It is practice repeated so often that skilled hands no longer need to explain what they are doing. And that kind of knowledge is incredibly fragile. So when we walk through ancient ruins, we are not walking through an intact past. We are walking through a filtered remnant, a few durable bones of a much larger living world. The stone foundations are still there, but the wooden doors are gone. The painted walls have faded, the fabric has rotted. The kitchens are silent, the voices have stopped. And if this is true even for civilizations with famous ruins, inscriptions and surviving monuments, imagine what it means for societies that built mainly in wood, earth, reeds, bamboo, or other materials that decay quickly. Their absence may not mean they achieved little. It may simply mean that everyday life was never designed to last for thousands of years. Neither, for that matter, were most of the things we depend on now. Neither, for that matter, were most of the things we depend on now. Your phone is not made to survive 1,000 years. Neither is a laptop, a car, a power station, a data center, an aircraft, a plastic bottle, or almost any of the machines that make modern life possible. They feel permanent because they are everywhere. We are surrounded by steel, glass, concrete cables, satellites, highways, chemical plants, and cities with millions of people. It is easy to imagine that our civilization has stamped itself so deeply onto Earth that it could never be erased. But geology has a very different idea of permanence. Give a city a few centuries without maintenance, and water starts getting in. Metal rusts. Roofs collapse. Plants push through pavement. Drainage systems clog. Freeze and thaw break roads apart. Concrete cracks, exposing the steel reinforcement inside, which expands as it corrodes and tears the structure open from within. Give it a few thousand years, and the process accelerates. A modern skyscraper is not a pyramid. It depends on constant repair. Pumps, coatings, sealed windows, electrical systems, controlled temperatures, replacement parts. Remove the people who maintain it, and it becomes a very tall ruin with a surprisingly short future. Give it hundreds of thousands or millions of years, and things get stranger still. Rivers change course, coastlines move, ice sheets advance and retreat. Forests grow over suburbs, sediment buries what remains. Tectonic plates slowly carry parts of the surface down into the earth, where rock is melted, crushed, transformed, and recycled. So could an industrial civilization disappear, not just collapse, like Rome or the Maya, leaving roads, ruins, and inscriptions. Could a civilization with factories, machines, fossil fuels, and global trade become so thoroughly erased that future beings might not know it had ever existed? This question has a name. It is sometimes called the Silurian hypothesis. Despite the dramatic title, it is not a claim that reptilian people secretly built cities before humans. It is a scientific thought experiment, a way of asking a serious question. If an industrial civilization had existed millions of years ago, what evidence would it leave behind? And after deep time had done its work, would we still be able to recognize that evidence? The answer is not nothing. An industrial society changes the planet in ways that go beyond buildings. It changes the chemistry of the air. It moves enormous amounts of rock and soil. It burns buried carbon that has been locked underground for millions of years. It produces metals in unusual concentrations. It creates synthetic chemicals. It spreads materials across continents and oceans. Some of those changes could leave marks in sediments, the layers of mud, sand, ash, and organic material that eventually become rock. Our own age is already producing a strange geological signature. When coal, oil, and gas are burned, they release carbon that was once stored deep underground. This changes the balance of carbon isotopes in the atmosphere and oceans. Future geologists examining sediments from our time may see a sudden disturbance in the carbon cycle, a sharp signal showing that something unusual happened very quickly. They may also find evidence of warming oceans, changing rainfall, expanding dead zones, altered soils, and shifts in which species lived where. They may see a mass movement of animals and plants around the world, including extinctions and the explosive spread of species carried by humans. Then there is plastic. Plastic seems almost indestructible in everyday life. But deep time does not leave it untouched. Sunlight breaks it down. Waves grind it into fragments. Microbes may slowly alter some forms. Heat, pressure, and chemistry change it further after burial. Still, plastic could leave traces, not necessarily recognizable bottles or bags, but strange carbon-rich residues, unusual chemical compounds, perhaps layers containing particles unlike anything produced by natural processes. Already, researchers have found plastic fused with sand, rock, and other materials in places where it has melted or burned. If buried quickly enough, some of these fragments might endure. Metals could leave signals too, not cars and bridges in their original form. Those would corrode, collapse, and scatter. But the mining, smelting, refining, and manufacturing behind them can concentrate elements in ways nature rarely does. Lead, copper, chromium, nickel, aluminum, rare earth elements. Industrial activity could create unusual patterns in soil and sediment, especially near former mines, factories, landfills, and cities. Concrete may also have a geological afterlife. It will crack and weather, but vast quantities of it could become a distinctive kind of rubble layer. Future researchers might find fragments containing crushed stone, artificial binders, steel traces, glass and chemical mixtures that do not occur naturally in quite the same way. And then there are radioactive materials. Nuclear weapons testing, reactor accidents, and nuclear power have released isotopes that can be measured in modern sediments. Some decay quickly on geological timescales. Others last much longer. Plutonium-239, for example, has a half-life of more than 24,000 years. That is a long time by human standards. But it is not very long by the standards of ancient rocks. After millions of years, even many radioactive clues would fade, and a future civilization would face a difficult problem. A strange isotope signal might indicate nuclear technology, or it might have another explanation. Nature is complicated. Volcanoes, asteroid impacts, wildfires, changes in ocean chemistry, and massive biological events can all produce dramatic signals in the geological record. This is the central challenge of the Silurian hypothesis. A single strange layer would not prove an ancient industrial civilization. A sudden carbon disturbance might come from volcanic activity. An extinction might come from climate change or an impact. An unusual metal concentration might result from natural mineral deposits. Even a chemical anomaly might be altered beyond recognition after millions of years underground. To make the case, you would need a pattern, multiple signals appearing together, rapid carbon cycle disruption, strange synthetic compounds, unusual metal distributions, evidence of massive extraction and land disturbance, perhaps traces of materials that are extremely difficult to explain without technology. And even then, caution would be essential, because the deeper we go into time, the more incomplete the archive becomes. Most of Earth's surface is constantly being erased and remade. The ocean floor is especially young, geologically speaking, because it is recycled back into the mantle. Ancient coastlines where civilizations are most likely to have flourished are often drowned, buried, or destroyed. A prehistoric industrial world might leave a faint scar, but it would not leave a neat museum exhibit. There would be no preserved highway map, no intact factories, no glowing sign saying civilization was here. At least, probably not. And this is where the idea becomes both humbling and dangerous. Humbling because it reminds us how temporary our enormous world may be. Dangerous because it can tempt people to treat the gaps in the record as proof of anything they want. At present, there is no credible evidence that a forgotten prehistoric industrial civilization existed on Earth before humans. We have no ancient layer containing machines, manufactured alloys in clear industrial contexts, global networks of synthetic materials, or unmistakable signs of large-scale technology from millions of years ago. The known geological record contains mysteries, certainly. But mysteries are not automatically evidence of lost high technology. The past is full of surprises. Göbekli Tepe surprised us. Angkor surprised us. The Amazon surprised us. Entire cities can hide beneath forests, fields, deserts, and modern streets. But discovering that ancient people were more capable, organized, or inventive than we once assumed is not the same as discovering a vanished industrial age. Still, the question changes how we look at ourselves. If our civilization ended tomorrow, what would remain after 10,000 years? After 100,000? After 10 million? Not our screens. Not our cloud storage. Not most of our books, photographs, recordings, or names. Perhaps only scattered layers, a chemical pulse, broken concrete, strange particles in mud, a brief disruption in the planet's ancient breathing, a civilization vast enough to alter the whole Earth, reduced eventually to a whisper in stone. So how do archaeologists search for a civilization that may have been reduced to a whisper in stone? They do not begin by digging random holes in the ground. That is the old movie version of archaeology, a person with a hat, a map, and a shovel uncovering a lost city before sunset. Real archaeology is slower, stranger, and in some ways much more powerful. It often begins from far above the ground. Satellite imagery can reveal things that are almost invisible to someone standing on the surface. A buried wall may change the way crops grow above it. Stone foundations can hold less moisture than surrounding soil, making plants slightly shorter or paler. Old ditches may retain water, creating darker lines across a field. From space, these faint differences can form rectangles, circles, roads, canals, and outlines of settlements that have been hidden for centuries. In dry regions, satellites can detect ancient river channels beneath desert sands. In crowded modern landscapes, they can help trace roads and field systems covered by towns, farms, and highways. Archaeologists are not looking for glowing ruins. Usually they are looking for patterns. A line where no line should be. A curve too regular to be natural. A cluster of soil changes suggesting that people once built, planted, dug, burned, traded, and lived there. Then there is LIDAR. LIDAR works by sending out pulses of laser light and measuring how long they take to return. From an aircraft, it can build an extraordinarily detailed map of the ground beneath trees. Forest canopies that seem impenetrable from below become almost transparent in the data. This is how researchers have identified vast networks of roads, terraces, canals, reservoirs and earthworks around places like Angkor and across parts of the Maya lowlands. Not because the forest suddenly gave up its secrets, but because tiny differences in elevation became visible. A low mound, a raised causeway, a geometric platform, a ditch running for miles through jungle. It is a little like brushing dust from an old drawing, except the drawing may cover thousands of square miles. But not all lost landscapes are on land. Some of the most promising places to search are underwater. During the last ice age, sea level was much lower than it is today. Huge areas of what are now shallow seas were once plains, river valleys, wetlands and coastlines. Places where people may have camped, hunted, buried their dead, built boats, and formed communities. Underwater archaeologists use sonar to map the seafloor. They use sub-bottom profilers which send sound waves into sediment, searching for buried channels, old shorelines, and drowned landscapes. Divers and remotely operated vehicles investigate places too deep or dangerous for ordinary excavation. Sediment cores can reveal ancient pollen, charcoal, shells, and microscopic traces of changing environments. The drowned world is difficult to study. Waves scatter artifacts. Currents bury them. Rising seas reshape everything. But difficult is not the same as impossible. On land, archaeologists can also look beneath the surface without breaking it open. Ground-penetrating radar sends signals into the soil and records how they bounce back from buried features. Magnetometry detects tiny changes in Earth's magnetic field caused by hearths, brick walls, ditches, kilns, and disturbed soil. Electrical resistance surveys measure how easily moisture moves through the ground, helping reveal stone structures, graves, and ancient trenches. These methods do not produce perfect pictures. They produce clues, a shadow in the data, an anomaly, something that deserves a closer look. And then comes one of archaeology's most important tools. Time. Finding an object is only the beginning. Archaeologists need to know when it was made, when it was used, when it was buried, and whether it truly belongs with the materials around it. Radiocarbon dating can estimate the age of once-living material, such as charcoal, bone, wood, and seeds. Other techniques date heated stone, sediments exposed to sunlight, volcanic ash, or layers of mineral growth. No single date is magic. Samples can be contaminated. Materials can be moved. An old piece of wood can be burned long after the tree died. So archaeologists compare dates with each other, with soil layers, with environmental records, and with the objects found nearby. They build a case slowly. Lake mud, cave deposits, ice cores, pollen records, tree rings, and marine sediments can reveal the world around an ancient settlement. Was rainfall failing? Did forests disappear? Was there a flood, a volcanic eruption, a shift in farming, an increase in burning? A ruined city makes more sense when you understand the climate, food supply, disease pressures, and landscapes that surrounded it. Ancient DNA adds another layer. DNA recovered from human bones, animals, plants, and sometimes sediments can reveal migration, ancestry, diet, disease, and changing populations. It can show that people thought to be isolated were connected. It can reveal that a community did not simply vanish, but moved, mixed with neighbouring groups, or survived in a different form. But the most important knowledge does not always come from a laboratory. Local communities and indigenous peoples often know landscapes in ways outsiders do not. They know old place names, seasonal paths, sacred areas, oral histories, buried springs, ruined terraces, and places where ancestors are remembered. In many parts of the world, this knowledge has guided archaeological discoveries that satellites and machines alone would never have found. And it raises an essential question. Just because something can be excavated, should it be? Digging is destructive. Once a layer is removed, it can never be put back exactly as it was. Human remains, sacred sites, and ancestral objects are not simply data waiting to be collected. They may belong to living communities with their own rights, traditions, and wishes. Sometimes the best excavation is no excavation at all. Sometimes the responsible choice is to map a site, protect it, and leave it for future researchers with better tools and better questions. That is how history comes back into view. Not in one dramatic revelation, but through patient accumulation. A satellite pattern, a buried wall, a grain of pollen, a date from charcoal, a story preserved in a community, a strand of ancient DNA. One clue means little, but enough clues, carefully tested, can turn silence into a landscape full of people. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question. If archaeologists of the distant future were searching for us, what would they find? Imagine it is 500 years from now, or 5,000. The languages we speak have changed beyond recognition. The nations on our maps are gone, divided, merged, renamed, or remembered only as uncertain territories in damaged records. Our cities may still stand in fragments, or they may be buried beneath sediment, swallowed by forests, broken by earthquakes, reshaped by rising seas. A future researcher enters what was once one of our great urban centres. They find concrete foundations, bridges, subway tunnels, rusted steel, vast deposits of glass, plastic, ceramic, brick, and crushed stone. They find strange layers in the ground filled with industrial ash, chemical residues, and the bones of animals that lived beside us in enormous numbers. They may find our highways long before they find our houses. Roadbeds can survive in altered form for centuries. Dams, tunnels, seawalls, ports, canals, and massive earthworks may leave scars on the landscape long after the systems that maintained them have failed. The largest buildings may endure as broken shells. Some monuments may remain recognizable. A few carved inscriptions, engraved plaques, or stone markers might still be readable if someone can decipher the language. But much of what feels most important to us may vanish almost completely. Think about your own daily life. How much of it exists as a physical object? Messages, photographs, bank records, work files, medical records, videos, maps, books, music, passwords, conversations with people you love. More and more of it lives in digital form, stored on devices, in data centers, and in systems that depend on electricity, cooling, replacement parts, software networks, and institutions. A clay tablet can sit in the ground for 4,000 years and still be read. A hard drive can fail in a decade. A printed book can survive neglect, fire, flood, and chance better than we might expect. But a digital archive may become inaccessible, even if the information is technically still there. Future researchers might recover a server filled with files, yet have no functioning machine capable of reading them. Or they may have the machine, but not the code, or the code, but not the encryption key. The information age may prove to be one of the most documented periods in human history. It may also prove strangely fragile. Of course, not everything will disappear. We produce objects on a scale few earlier societies could have imagined. Plastic, for all its dangers, may become one of our most persistent signatures. Landfills could preserve sealed layers of packaging, clothing, toys, tools, and discarded appliances. Industrial sites may leave chemical fingerprints in soils and sediments. Nuclear tests, fossil fuel emissions, and altered patterns of pollen and animal bones may mark our presence across the planet. Future scientists may identify our age not from our greatest works of art or our most brilliant ideas, but from a thin global layer containing concrete dust, synthetic polymers, heavy metals, and the remains of billions of chickens. That thought is almost funny. Almost, because preservation is never fair. A wealthy district built in stone and steel may leave more evidence than a poor neighbourhood built from cheaper materials. The homes of powerful people may be recorded in archives, museums, and monuments. The lives of workers, migrants, farmers, caregivers, and children may survive mostly as fragments. A broken cup, a shoe sole, a food wrapper, traces of smoke in a wall. Even now our historical record is uneven. Some people leave entire libraries behind. Others leave no written trace at all, and technology does not solve that problem. It can make it worse. A single corporation may preserve vast quantities of data. A single war, blackout, economic collapse, or policy decision may erase access to it. A photograph uploaded to a cloud server can seem permanent right up until the company disappears. So what would future archaeologists conclude about us? They might see a species with astonishing technical power. A people who reshaped rivers, moved mountains, crossed oceans in hours, sent machines beyond the atmosphere, and built networks that connected billions of minds. They might also see a species dependent on systems so complex that when they failed, ordinary life became difficult to reconstruct. They may know we had computers without understanding what we did with them. They may find the skeleton of a skyscraper without knowing who lived inside. They may recover fragments of our entertainment, our advertisements, our laws, our arguments, and mistake them for the most important things we believed. Or perhaps they will discover something we have overlooked. A buried library, a sealed archive, a cache of books, a city drowned in a way that preserves rather than destroys, a collection of ordinary letters that reveals more about us than all our monuments ever could. That is the central lesson of the deep past. What survives is not necessarily what mattered most. A civilization can be important, inventive, compassionate, cruel, beautiful, and complex, yet leave almost nothing that time is willing to keep. Another can survive in stone while the lives behind that stone become unknowable. History is not a complete memory, it is a damaged inheritance. And beyond the edges of that inheritance are countless human lives we cannot yet see. And that is where we have to be careful. The fact that history is incomplete does not mean that every gap in the record contains a vanished empire, a forgotten machine age, or a civilization more advanced than our own. Missing evidence is not evidence of whatever we hope to find. A blank space on the map is still a blank space. It is not proof of a lost kingdom waiting beneath the soil. Archaeology works best when it follows the traces that really exist. A shard of pottery, a buried wall, a change in pollen, human bones, charcoal from an ancient fire, strange chemicals in lake sediments. A forgotten inscription, a settlement pattern visible from the air. From small pieces, researchers build careful arguments. They compare sites, they test dates, they question old assumptions. And when the evidence is thin, the honest answer is sometimes the least satisfying one. We do not know, but not knowing is not the same as knowing nothing. Because genuine surprises are possible. They have happened again and again. Göbekli Tepe showed that people without cities could gather, organize labour, and build monuments far earlier than many scholars had expected. Angkor revealed vast urban landscapes hidden beneath forest. LIDAR surveys in the Americas have shown roads, terraces, platforms, and dense settlement networks where older narratives imagined empty wilderness. Underwater archaeology continues to find drowned ports, villages, and landscapes along coasts that were once dry land. Every discovery changes the shape of the question. Not were ancient people secretly identical to us in every way, but what were they capable of that we have underestimated? How many communities lived in places now buried beneath rivers, fields, cities, deserts, forests, or oceans? How many traditions were carried in wood, cloth, reeds, earth, song, and memory rather than stone? How many societies built their lives around systems we are only beginning to recognize? Seasonal movement, water management, trade routes, ritual landscapes, food forests, or alliances between communities separated by hundreds of miles. The deeper we look, the more we find that civilization does not have one shape. It is not always a walled city, not always a palace, a king list, a writing system, or a monument large enough to impress strangers thousands of years later. Human beings have organized complex lives in many different ways. Some left pyramids, some left roads, some left earthworks. Some left almost nothing except subtle changes in soil and the faint outlines of homes seen only when the sun is low or the ground is scanned from above. And even those traces are under attack. Water erases. Coastlines move, seas rise, rivers flood and change course. Groundwater dissolves bone and wood. Storms tear apart exposed sites before anyone has a chance to study them. Climate erases. Forests grow over stone. Deserts swallow roads. Freeze and thaw crack walls. Heat, rain and wind reduce buildings to rubble, then dust, then a slight discoloration beneath the grass. Conflict erases. Cities burn. Temples are dismantled. Archives are destroyed. Conquerors rewrite the past, sometimes deliberately, sometimes simply by building their own lives on top of what came before. Decay erases. Iron rusts, wood rots, cloth disappears. Food vanishes. Bodies return to the soil. The ordinary objects of ordinary people, the things that made up most human lives, are often the first to go. Bias erases too. For a long time, archaeologists looked hardest for the kinds of societies they already expected to find. Stone buildings, kings, graves full of gold, written records in languages familiar enough to recognize. When evidence did not fit those expectations, it could be ignored, misunderstood, or assigned to someone else. And then there is time. Time does not need a dramatic catastrophe to destroy a civilization's memory. It only needs enough centuries, enough rain, enough roots, enough rebuilding, enough generations, forgetting the old names for hills, rivers, ruins, and roads. So perhaps the civilizations we cannot yet see are not hidden because they were impossible. Perhaps they are hidden because the world is very good at covering its tracks. Some may be waiting beneath a modern city, unreachable, without tearing apart the world above them. Some may lie under shallow seas where divers have barely begun to search, Some may be preserved in remote valleys beneath jungle canopies, or in deserts so vast that a lifetime of searching would cover only a small part of them. And some may be gone beyond recovery. That is the quiet truth beneath all of this. Humanity is ancient, our achievements are remarkable. Our stories feel permanent while we are living inside them. But in deep time, permanence is rare. Even the greatest cities become hills. Even the clearest words can become unreadable marks. Even a whole world of people can be reduced to a few stones, a layer of ash, and a question. We are not the first people to believe our age matters. We will not be the last, and somewhere beneath the surface of the earth, beneath water and forest and sand, there may still be evidence of lives that have not yet entered the human story. Not necessarily lost super-civilizations, not necessarily answers to every mystery, but real people, real communities, real experiments in how to survive, cooperate, create, and remember, waiting patiently for someone to notice. If this journey through forgotten worlds helped you see the past a little differently, please like, comment, and subscribe. And let us know where you are listening from tonight. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify through the link in the description. Until then, rest easy. The past is larger than we know, and beneath the silence, it is still waiting.